My parents banned me from their 40th anniversary party because my presence would ruin the aesthetic for my white brother-in-law's elite colleagues. 2 hours later, my sister posted a family photo on the grand staircase, bragging about how her husband bought our parents their dream estate. I took a sip of my wine, liked the photo, and left a simple comment congratulating them on inheriting the $150,000 mortgage I actually owned. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to remind your family who really holds the power. The voicemail from my mother. Helen had arrived precisely at 4 in the afternoon. I was standing in the kitchen of my downtown penthouse, reviewing a commercial property appraisal, when her crisp, overly enunciated words filled the quiet room. "Maya, it is your mother. I am calling to inform you that we have decided it is best if you do not attend the anniversary dinner tonight. Julian is bringing some of his senior partners from the firm, a very elite crowd. We need the evening to be flawless. You showing up with your cynical attitude and your constant need to challenge everything, Julian says, will just ruin the aesthetic we are trying to present. Stay home. We will send you some leftover cake tomorrow." The message ended with a sharp click. There was no hesitation, no guilt in her voice. Just the cold, calculated dismissal I had grown accustomed to over the past 32 years. I am a successful real estate appraiser and property manager. I built a multi-million-dollar portfolio from the ground up, navigating one of the most cutthroat industries for a Black woman in America. But to my parents, I was just the difficult daughter who refused to assimilate into their desperate performance of high society respectability. My phone screen lit up again, cutting through my thoughts. It was a social media notification. My 29-year-old sister Chloe had just uploaded a new picture. I opened the app and there they were. The golden child, my enabler parents, and Julian, the white savior of the family. They were standing on the grand sweeping staircase of my parents' colonial estate, holding crystal flutes filled with expensive champagne. They all wore perfectly tailored evening wear, their smiles wide and practiced for the camera. Chloe's caption was a masterclass in manufactured perfection. Family only. So blessed to celebrate 40 years of Black excellence with my amazing parents. And an extra special thank you to my incredible husband Julian, who officially bought this dream estate for our parents today. Generational wealth starts here. I stared at the screen. Generational wealth. The audacity of those words almost made me laugh out loud. Julian, the Wall Street finance executive, loved to play the generous benefactor. He loved the adulation my parents showered on him, treating him like royalty because his presence validated their proximity to white wealth. They worshipped the ground he walked on, completely blind to the fact that his entire persona was a house of cards. I did not shed a single tear. I did not feel the familiar sting of rejection that used to paralyze me in my 20s. Instead, I walked over to my wine fridge, poured myself a generous glass of Cabernet, and walked back to the kitchen island. I zoomed in on Julian's smug, punchable face in the photograph. Then I tapped the heart icon to like the post. My fingers moved steadily across the keyboard as I drafted my response for her thousands of followers to see. Congrats on the milestone. Since Julian officially bought the house today, I assume you both will be taking over the $150,000 mortgage I hold on the property. The property taxes are due at the end of this month too. All yours now. Enjoy the estate. I hit send. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my wine and set the phone face down on the marble counter. For exactly 5 minutes, the penthouse was completely silent. The only sound was the distant hum of city traffic far below my windows. I pictured the exact moment my comment popped up on Chloe's phone. I imagined the color draining from my mother's face as the notifications started rolling in from her country club friends asking questions. I envisioned Julian's carefully crafted savior complex shattering in real time. Then the chaos began. My phone vibrated against the marble counter. Chloe. I ignored it. 10 seconds later it rang again. Helen. Ignored. Then Marcus, my father. I picked up my wine glass and moved to the living room, leaving the phone on the kitchen island where it began to light up like a malfunctioning machine. The screen displayed a relentless stream of incoming calls and frantic text messages. 10 missed calls. 20 missed calls. By the time I finished my glass of wine, there were exactly 40 missed calls logging on the screen. The social media post vanished completely. Chloe had deleted it in a blind panic, but the damage was already done. The internet remembers everything, and my comment had lived long enough to ignite a firestorm among their perfectly curated social circle. An hour passed. The relentless ringing finally stopped, replaced by an eerie stillness. I opened my laptop to review a new property acquisition, completely unfazed by the digital explosion I had just caused. Then the heavy oak door of my penthouse violently rattled in its frame. Fists pounded against the wood, the impacts so hard they echoed down the long hallway of my unit. The heavy thuds were accompanied by muffled, furious shouting from the other side. My building has strict security, but my parents were still on the approved visitor list from a year ago. A mistake I would be rectifying first thing tomorrow morning. I calmly closed my laptop, walked to the front door, and unlocked the deadbolt. I pulled the door open to find a scene of absolute hysteria. Marcus and Helen stood there, their expensive anniversary attire disheveled, their faces twisted in a mixture of rage and terror. But it was Julian who lunged forward first. His face was beet red, his neck veins bulging against his stiff white collar. The arrogant finance executive from the photograph was entirely gone, replaced by a desperate, cornered man. He stepped aggressively into my personal space, pointing a shaking finger mere inches from my face. "You are going to log back onto the internet and post a public retraction right now," he snarled, spit flying from his lips. "You are going to tell everyone that your comment was a malicious lie, or I swear to God, Maya, I will sue you for defamation and drag you into bankruptcy court. I will destroy your entire company." I stood my ground, not stepping back a single inch, as Julian invaded my personal space. He loomed over me, a tall, impeccably dressed finance executive, accustomed to women shrinking in his presence. His face was flushed with the kind of entitled outrage reserved for those who had never been told no in their entire lives. He crossed his arms, his expensive tailored suit pulling tight across his shoulders, completely secure in his belief that a few legal threats would force me into submission. My father pushed past Julian, his face twisted in a scowl. "You have lost your mind, Maya," Marcus yelled, his voice echoing off the high ceilings of my penthouse. "Julian has done nothing but uplift this family. He literally paid off our mortgage so your mother and I could retire in peace. And you repay him by making up vicious lies on the internet just to embarrass your sister in front of his elite colleagues." My mother stepped forward, her eyes narrowing as she looked me up and down. She clutched her designer purse like a shield, her expression dripping with pity and contempt. "We all know what this really is," Helen said, her voice laced with venom. "You are a bitter, jealous woman. You cannot stand that Chloe found a successful, wealthy husband who takes care of her while you sit alone in this empty apartment. You are 32 years old, unmarried, and so resentful of your sister's fairy tale marriage that you have resorted to inventing fantasies just to tear her down. It is pathetic, Maya. It is exactly why nobody wants to deal with you." I let them talk. I let them empty their clips, watching the delusion play out in real time. My own parents were standing in a penthouse I bought with my own money, looking down on me to defend a man who was actively lying to them. For years I had endured their backhanded compliments and their constant reminders that I was the disappointment of the family. I had watched them bend over backwards to accommodate Julian, silencing my opinions at the dinner table so he could speak, and proudly parading his whiteness around their country club friends as a trophy. They had traded their dignity for the illusion of generational wealth, completely blind to the fact that I was the one silently subsidizing their lifestyle. I had worked 80-hour weeks and clawed my way to the top of a ruthless industry, only to be called a jealous spinster in my own home. Julian smirked, clearly emboldened by my parents' blind loyalty. He adjusted his silk tie and lowered his voice into a condescending drawl. "Listen to your mother, Maya. Take the post down. Issue a public apology on all your social media platforms. Say your account was hacked or that you made a tasteless joke. Do it right now, and I might convince my legal team to spare your little real estate appraisal business. If you refuse, I will personally see to it that you never work in this city again." I did not argue. I did not yell. I simply turned my back on them and walked unhurriedly toward the kitchen pantry, where a biometric safe was built seamlessly into the custom cabinetry. I pressed my thumb against the scanner. The heavy steel door clicked open. I reached inside and pulled out a thick certified legal folder. I walked back to the kitchen island and slammed the heavy stack of papers onto the marble countertop. The resounding thud made my mother jump. Defamation. I asked, my voice dangerously calm. I looked directly into Julian's eyes. You told my parents you gave them $150,000 to save their house from foreclosure 3 years ago. You played the white savior perfectly, Julian. Funny thing though, your check bounced. It cleared absolutely nothing. The bank was ready to seize the property the very next morning. Julian's smirk vanished. A bead of sweat formed at his hairline. He opened his mouth but no sound came out. I slid the top document across the marble so it rested directly in front of my father. I bought the debt, I stated, enunciating every syllable. I bought it through my holding company, Apex Holdings. Go ahead, Marcus. Read the signature on the certified deed of trust. I am the legal lien holder of your estate. My father stared at the document, his eyes scanning the official county seals and the bold print of my corporate entity. His hands began to shake. Helen snatched the paper from him, refusing to even look at the words. This is a forgery, she snapped, waving the document in the air. You are out of your mind if you think we are going to believe this garbage. Julian is a top-tier finance executive on Wall Street. He manages multi-million-dollar portfolios. You are just a lowly property manager. You probably printed this off the internet to try and extort us. Julian paid off that house and we have the bank receipts to prove it. She turned to Julian for confirmation, her face desperate for reassurance. Tell her, Julian. Tell her how ridiculous she sounds. Julian swallowed hard. His eyes darted toward the front door, then back to the paperwork. It is a clerical error, he stammered, his voice suddenly lacking its previous authority. The bank made a mistake with the routing numbers back then. My accountants are already fixing it. Maya is just manipulating a banking glitch to make herself look important. I was sweating profusely now. The tailored suit suddenly looked like a straitjacket. He refused to make eye contact with me, knowing exactly what I held in my hands. A clerical error that lasted 3 years. I asked, a cold smile spreading across my face. That is a fascinating legal defense, Julian. I cannot wait to hear your high-priced lawyers argue that in front of a federal judge. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. I opened my email application, tapping the screen a few times to bring up a scheduled draft. My mother took a step forward, her voice rising in panic. What are you doing? Put that phone away right now. I locked eyes with Julian, savoring the absolute terror radiating from him. I just clicked send. I said, my voice cutting through the tension like a blade. I just emailed the official notice of default to both of you and to your beloved son-in-law. You have exactly 30 days to pay the $150,000 principal plus 3 years of accumulated interest and late fees. If the funds are not in my escrow account by 5 in the afternoon on the 30th day, I am foreclosing on the estate. The room went completely silent. My parents stared at me, the color rapidly draining from their faces as my words finally penetrated their wall of denial. The absolute certainty in my voice left no room for their usual manipulations. They had expected me to fold. They had expected me to cry and beg for their approval just like I did when I was a teenager. But that version of me was dead and buried. I walked over to the front door and pulled it wide open, letting the cold air from the hallway rush into the tense room. Now get out of my house. The heavy oak door slammed shut behind them, the click of the deadbolt echoing with absolute finality. I did not lose a single wink of sleep. By 7 the next morning, I was already seated at the mahogany desk in my corner office. My real estate appraisal firm occupied the 14th floor of a downtown high-rise, a space I had purchased and designed myself. The morning was proceeding exactly as planned until the glass doors of the lobby burst open. My assistant barely had time to stand before Chloe barged past, her heels clicking frantically against the hardwood floor. My sister marched straight into my office, holding her phone high on a stabilizer stick. Her eyes were red and puffy. A single perfectly manufactured tear rolled down her cheek. She was live streaming to her 150,000 followers. Look at her! Chloe sobbed, pointing the camera lens directly at my face. This is my toxic, jealous sister. Look at the woman who is trying to illegally steal our parents' home. She is so bitter that I have a successful husband and a beautiful life that she is forging legal documents just to throw our elderly parents out onto the street. She wants to render them homeless out of pure, unadulterated spite. Several of my employees had stepped out of their cubicles watching the spectacle in stunned silence. Chloe stepped closer, thrusting the phone forward as if the camera was a weapon. She was dressed for maximum sympathy, wearing a neutral beige cashmere sweater and holding a pristine $20,000 Himalayan Birkin bag over her forearm. "Tell them, Maya!" Chloe cried, her voice echoing shrilly off the glass walls. "Tell my followers why you hate your own black family so much. Tell them why you cannot stand to see us thriving." I did not cover my face. I did not shrink away from the glowing ring light attached to her phone. I calmly reached over to my desk phone, pressed the intercom button, and instructed the front desk to send building security up immediately. Then I stood up, smoothed the lapels of my tailored blazer, and walked directly toward my sister. I stopped mere inches from the camera lens. I looked straight into the camera, bypassing Chloe completely. "Crying for your followers, Chloe?" I asked, my voice projecting crisp and clear into the microphone. I tilted my head, gesturing toward her arm. "Did you happen to tell your loyal subscribers that the $20,000 Hermes Birkin you are holding was bought using a HELOC, a home equity line of credit taken out against the exact same house you are accusing me of stealing?" Chloe froze, her fake weeping hitched in her throat. I kept my eyes locked on the lens, delivering the truth with surgical precision. "You and Julian drained the last drop of equity from our parents' estate to buy designer bags and lease foreign cars, so you could cosplay wealth on the internet. You are literally wearing our parents' debt on your arm right now. And since I own the primary mortgage note on that house, I know exactly when that credit line was opened and exactly where the money went." Chloe yanked the phone back as if the device had suddenly caught fire. The screen was still visible to me, and I watched the live chat explode. Hundreds of comments flooded the stream in real time. Emojis of trash cans and clown faces scrolled rapidly upward. Followers were demanding answers, recognizing the financial terminology I had just dropped. The facade of black excellence she had curated for years was burning to the ground in front of an audience of thousands. "Stop it!" Chloe shrieked, her thumb frantically tapping the screen, trying to find the end broadcast button. She missed it twice, her manicured fingers trembling violently. "You are lying. You are a liar. I am a licensed property appraiser," I replied, stepping forward and forcing her to retreat toward the door. "I have the receipts. You have a fake bag bought with borrowed money. Now get out of my office before I have you arrested for trespassing." Just as she finally managed to kill the live stream, the elevator dinged. Two burly security guards stepped onto the floor. They did not hesitate, grabbing Chloe by both of her cashmere-clad elbows. She thrashed against their grip, her designer bag sliding off her arm and hitting the floor, but they marched her backward toward the exit. "You are going to pay for this, Maya," she screamed, her voice cracking as they dragged her into the elevator lobby. "Julian is going to destroy you." I watched the elevator doors slide shut, cutting off her hysterical threats. I turned to my staff, who were all standing in dead silence. "Back to work, everyone," I commanded firmly. The office immediately returned to its usual hum of activity. I walked back to my desk, picked up the Birkin bag. Chloe had dropped in her panic and tossed it carelessly into the wastebasket by my door. I sat down and opened a new property file, my pulse completely steady. I had expected a tantrum. I had expected the public victim routine. It was exactly why I had the financial data memorized and ready to deploy. I barely had time to review the first page of my report before the sleek black phone on my desk rang. The caller ID displayed an unfamiliar out-of-state number. I picked up the receiver. "Maya speaking." "Ms. Maya," a sharp, authoritative male voice said on the other end of the line. "My name is Richard Vance. I am senior corporate counsel representing your brother-in-law, Julian." I leaned back in my leather chair. "I assume you are calling about the notice of default I emailed last night. I am calling to inform you that we have just filed an emergency injunction in federal court to halt your fraudulent foreclosure proceedings." The lawyer stated, his tone dripping with the arrogant certainty of a man used to crushing his opponents. "You made a severe miscalculation." We possess ironclad proof of a wire transfer, confirming Julian paid off the entire mortgage balance 3 years ago. We have the routing numbers, the bank confirmation, and the digital receipts. You will be hearing from a judge by the end of the week. The line went dead. I slowly placed the receiver back onto its cradle. A cold, predatory smile spread across my face. They thought they had a wire transfer. They thought they were holding the winning hand. They had no idea I already knew exactly where that money had actually gone. 2 days later, the air inside the sprawling glass-enclosed conference room of Vance and Associates felt sterile, heavily filtered, and perfectly climate-controlled. The massive mahogany table stretched between us like a battlefield. On one side sat Julian, his posture radiating that specific toxic brand of unearned Wall Street arrogance. He wore a bespoke navy suit exuding ultimate white privilege. Beside him was Richard Vance, a high-powered corporate litigator who looked like he billed by the second and never lost a case. My parents, Marcus and Helen, sat rigidly next to Julian, shooting me glares so filled with venom. You would think I was the one actively trying to destroy our family legacy. On my side of the table sat Kendra. She was a ruthless, brilliant black female litigator who wore a tailored crimson suit and an expression that suggested she was about to dissect Julian for sport. I sat right beside her, my hands folded calmly in my lap, perfectly at ease in the face of their collective hostility. Richard Vance cleared his throat, adjusting his heavy gold cufflinks before opening a thick leather binder. He slid a single crisp sheet of paper across the polished mahogany surface. It came to a stop directly in front of Kendra and me. As we stated in our emergency filing, Vance began, his voice dripping with unbearable condescension. My client fulfilled his financial obligation to this family 3 years ago. What you are looking at is a certified wire transfer receipt. It clearly shows $150,000 moved from Julian account directly to the original mortgage lender. This completely invalidates your fraudulent claim of holding any debt, Maya. We are demanding you withdraw the notice of default immediately and issue a formal apology, or we will proceed with civil and criminal charges for extortion and malicious defamation. My father leaned forward, tapping his index finger aggressively against the table. He looked at the piece of paper as if it were a holy relic sent down to save him. See that, Maya, Marcus said, his voice loud, booming, and authoritative. A real man handles his business. Julian stepped up when this family needed him, and he delivered exactly what he promised. Stop this embarrassment right now. You are dragging our name through the mud because you cannot handle the fact that Chloe married a provider while you have absolutely nobody. Helen chimed in, her arms crossed defensively over her chest, her lips pursed in disgust. It is a disgrace. We are sitting in a downtown law firm apologizing for our own daughter. I told you, Marcus. I told you she was just manipulating some banking error to make herself look powerful. She is just a property manager playing games with a high-level finance executive. It is humiliating. Julian, we are so incredibly sorry you have to deal with this petty jealousy. Julian offered my mother a tight, patronizing smile, reaching over to pat her hand gently. It is all right, Helen. I know Maya struggles with her mental health and harbors deep resentments. I am just glad we could clear up this little misunderstanding before the federal authorities had to get involved. I did not say a word. I did not need to defend myself against their gaslighting. I just looked at Kendra and gave her a slight nod. Kendra picked up the wire transfer receipt, adjusted her designer glasses, and offered a predatory, chilling smile. A wire transfer receipt, she said, her voice smooth like glass but carrying a lethal edge. How very official. She tossed their piece of paper aside like trash. Then she reached into her crimson briefcase and pulled out a thick, heavily tabbed legal folder. She dropped it onto the mahogany table with a heavy thud that made Julian physically flinch in his seat. The problem with submitting financial records into Discovery, Kendra continued, leaning forward and steepling her fingers, is that it gives me the legal right to subpoena the routing numbers attached to the transaction. And my client, being an absolute expert in real estate acquisitions, knows exactly how to trace a defaulted property through the system. Vance frowned, sitting up straighter, his confident demeanor slipping. What are you talking about? That receipt is certified by the bank. Oh, the money definitely left his account. Kendra agreed, pulling out a color-coded spreadsheet and sliding it toward the opposing counsel. But it certainly did not go to the bank holding the mortgage. We subpoenaed the SWIFT codes. That wire transfer went to an offshore shell company registered in the Cayman Islands, a company called Horizon Ventures. And guess whose name is listed as the sole primary beneficiary of Horizon Ventures? Kendra paused, locking her dark eyes with Julian. Julian's face lost all its color. The smug patrician mask melted away in an instant, leaving behind pure, unadulterated panic. "I did not pay off your house, Marcus," I said, finally speaking up. My voice was steady and razor-sharp, cutting through the silence of the room. "He embezzled the money from his own firm, funneled it into an offshore account, and let your house go into default. The bank was preparing to auction your home on the courthouse steps. That is when my company Apex Holdings stepped in. I paid off the arrears secretly and bought the debt to save you from being thrown out onto the street. Your golden boy took the cash and left you to drown." Marcus stared at me, blinking rapidly, then looked at Julian. "Julian, what is she talking about? Tell them they are lying. Tell them right now." Julian opened his mouth, but he was breathing heavily, his eyes darting frantically toward the heavy glass doors. Vance snatched the spreadsheet, his eyes scanning the subpoenaed banking records. The veteran lawyer face hardened as he realized his own client had just handed him falsified documents to submit to a federal judge. "It gets worse," Kendra added, not giving Julian a single second to formulate a lie or spin a new narrative. "You see, we were very curious about where Julian got the initial capital to funnel offshore in the first place, so we did a little more digging into his domestic accounts." Kendra pulled one final devastating document from her folder and slid it directly across the mahogany wood to my father. It was a commercial guarantor agreement, complete with notary stamps. Julian's smug mask completely cracked. He stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the hardwood floor, his hands shaking violently. "We are leaving," he commanded, grabbing his briefcase. "Vance, we are done here." "Sit down," Julian. Kendra snapped, her voice cracking like a whip. Before he could take another step toward the exit, she delivered the final crushing blow. "We found out how he got the money, Marcus. He forged your signature to act as a guarantor for a massive failing hedge fund. You do not just owe my client for the house, you are currently on the hook for millions of dollars." Marcus collapsed back into his leather chair, all the air rushing out of his lungs. He stared at the forged guarantor document, his hands trembling violently as he recognized his own falsified signature, binding him to Julian's catastrophic hedge fund collapse. Julian did not wait around to explain. He practically sprinted out of the conference room, leaving his own defense attorney scrambling to gather his files. Helen sat frozen, her mouth opening and closing in silent shock. I simply stood up, buttoned my blazer, and walked out of the law firm with Kendra by my side. 3 weeks passed in total silence. The chill of late November swept through the city, bringing with it the inevitable approach of the holidays. I spent the time closing 2 major commercial property deals and completely ignoring the frantic voicemails left by my parents. Then 4 days before the holiday, a beautifully embossed envelope arrived via courier to my penthouse. It was a formal invitation to Thanksgiving dinner at the estate. The enclosed note, penned in my mother's elegant cursive, claimed it was time for a healing moment. She wrote about setting aside our differences and coming together to break bread and mend fences. I knew exactly what it was. It was a trap. They were running out of time on the 30-day foreclosure notice and desperation was setting in. I could have stayed home, ordered a private chef, and enjoyed a peaceful evening looking out over the city skyline. Instead, I accepted the invitation. I was not going to give them the satisfaction of thinking I was afraid to face them. I arrived at the estate on Thursday evening, dressed immaculately for war. I wore a tailored deep emerald green crepe dress that commanded attention, paired with a vintage gold necklace that screamed quiet, unbothered luxury. When I stepped through the grand double doors, the air inside was thick with tension. The scent of roasted turkey, candied yams, and collard greens wafted from the kitchen, desperately trying to mask the overwhelming stench of panic. Marcus looked like he had aged 10 years in 3 weeks. His eyes were sunken, and his usual boastful posture had completely collapsed. Helen fluttered around the dining room with a forced, brittle smile, pouring wine with shaky hands. Chloe sat at the far end of the long mahogany table, her eyes darting nervously toward the front windows. Julian was seated next to her, downing his third glass of bourbon before the food had even been served. He refused to look in my direction. We took our seats. The charade lasted exactly 10 minutes. Helen emerged from the kitchen carrying the massive roasted turkey on a silver platter. She set it in the center of the table, wiping a single highly choreographed tear from her cheek. Then, instead of passing the plates, she reached into the pocket of her silk apron and pulled out a stapled stack of legal documents. She slid the paperwork across the polished wood until it rested directly in front of my empty dinner plate. "Maya, please," Helen began, her voice quivering with theatrical emotion. "We are a family. We are supposed to uplift each other, not tear each other down in front of the world. This is a simple waiver of the mortgage debt and a non-disclosure agreement regarding Julian's business dealings. I am begging you to sign it. We need to protect our Black family unity. We have worked too hard to build this generational wealth just to let it all fall apart over a misunderstanding. Be the bigger person today, for us." I looked down at the waiver. The sheer audacity of the request was almost impressive. They wanted me to eat a $150,000 loss, ignore a multi-million-dollar fraud scheme, and sign away my leverage so they could keep pretending to be high society royalty. I did not pick up the pen. Instead, I placed my hands flat on the table and slowly pushed the empty dinner plate along with the legal waiver back toward the center of the table. "Generational wealth," I asked, keeping my voice dangerously low and steady. "You want to talk about Black family unity and generational wealth right now?" Helen blinked, her fake tears drying up instantly. "I just want us to heal. You took the college fund. Grandma left specifically for me and used it to pay for Julian's luxury wedding venue," I stated, slicing through her manipulation like a scalpel. "You drained the only real generational wealth this family had just so you could show off to his wealthy white relatives. You subsidized his life while forcing me to take out crippling student loans to build mine. So do not sit here and weaponize family unity only when you need a financial bailout to save your own skin." Chloe slammed her hands on the table. "You are so selfish, Maya. You have all that money and you are just going to watch us lose everything. Julian is working on a fix. He just needs a little more time to move some capital around." Before I could respond to my sister's delusional defense, a sharp, piercing ringtone interrupted the screaming match. It was coming from Marcus's suit pocket. He pulled out his phone, staring at the caller ID with a look of absolute confusion. "It is the bank," Marcus muttered, his brow furrowing. "It is American Express." He answered the call and put it on speakerphone, his hands trembling so badly he nearly dropped the device. A polite automated voice echoed through the dining room. "This is a fraud alert from American Express. Your premium credit card has just been declined for a massive, unauthorized overseas wire transaction in the amount of $250,000. If you did not authorize this Cayman Islands transfer, please press 1. The color drained entirely from Marcus's face. He slowly turned his head to look at his son-in-law. Julian leaped up from his chair, his face slick with a terrified sweat, his eyes wide with animal panic. He reached for his coat, mumbling something incoherent about calling his broker. Chloe dropped her crystal wine glass. It shattered against the hardwood floor, sending dark red liquid pooling around her expensive shoes. She stared at Julian, her chest heaving, and accidentally blurted out the one thing she was never supposed to say out loud. "Julian, did those men from the Cayman accounts find you?" The dining room plunges into absolute suffocating chaos. The sound of Chloe shattering her crystal wine glass against the hardwood floor is nothing compared to the deafening reality of what she just confessed out loud. For a fraction of a second, the entire room is paralyzed. The fragrant scent of roasted turkey and candied yams is completely eclipsed by the metallic tang of fear. Then Julian snaps. The tailored, sophisticated Wall Street gentleman vanishes in a split second, replaced by a cornered, vicious animal. He lunges across the space between them, his face contorted in pure, unadulterated rage, and violently grabs Chloe by her upper arm. His fingers dig so deeply into her skin that she lets out a sharp, terrified shriek. "Shut your mouth, you stupid, spoiled brat!" Julian screams, his voice cracking with a terrifying intensity that echoes off the crystal chandeliers. "You were supposed to keep your mouth shut. I told you never to mention those accounts to anyone. Chloe struggles against his brutal grip. Tears stream down her face as she tries frantically to pry his fingers off her arm. The illusion of her perfect #blessed marriage shatters right in front of the holiday feast. She whimpers, stumbling sideways as he shakes her the pristine image of black excellence she curated for her followers, reduced to a scene of domestic terror. Marcus, finally snapping out of his shock, pushes his chair back so hard it tips over and crashes to the floor. The sight of this white man putting his hands on his black daughter flips a primal switch inside him. "Get your hands off her right now," Marcus bellows, charging around the edge of the long mahogany table. But Julian does not back down. As Marcus reaches out to intervene, Julian turns and shoves the older man with brutal, unhinged force. Marcus stumbles backward, his expensive leather shoes slipping on the spilled wine, and crashes hard against the vintage wooden credenza. The impact shakes the walls. He clutches his chest, gasping for air as the breath is knocked completely out of his lungs. He slides down the front of the furniture, his face pale and covered in a sudden sheen of cold sweat. Helen screams. She drops her silk napkin and rushes to her husband, dropping to her knees beside him. She hovers over him, her hands shaking uncontrollably, completely paralyzed by the sudden eruption of violence in her pristine, carefully managed dining room. Julian stands in the center of the wreckage, panting heavily. He looks down at my parents, his lip curling into a sneer of absolute disgust. The mask of the benevolent white savior is completely gone, revealing the predatory con artist hiding underneath. "You people are pathetic!" Julian spits out his voice, dripping with venom and racial contempt. "You were so desperate to parade me around your little country club. You wanted a wealthy white son-in-law so badly that you blindly signed every piece of paper I put in front of you without reading a single page of the fine print. You thought I was your golden ticket to high society. You actually believed I would spend my own hard-earned money to save this overpriced museum. You handed me your credit, your equity, and your signatures on a silver platter because you cared more about how you looked to your neighbors than protecting your own assets." He turns his glare toward Chloe, who is sobbing uncontrollably on the rug, cradling her bruised arm against her chest. "And you," Julian sneers at her, taking a threatening step forward. "You gladly spent the stolen money to fund your fake influencer lifestyle. You knew exactly what I was doing offshore, but as long as you got your designer bags and your luxury vacations, you looked the other way. Do not sit there and play the victim now. You are just as guilty as I am." Julian grabs his expensive wool coat from the back of his chair. He does not spare another glance at the family he just systematically destroyed. He turns on his heel and storms out of the dining room. The heavy oak front door slams shut with a thunderous boom that vibrates through the floorboards, leaving a ringing silence in its wake. The dining room is left in absolute shambles. Chloe is curled up on the rug, sobbing hysterically into her hands, her perfect dress ruined by the wine. Marcus is leaning against the credenza, his face pale, holding his chest as he tries to regulate his erratic breathing. The entire foundation of their respectable upper-class facade has been reduced to rubble. And yet Helen still stubbornly refuses to face the hard truth. My mother looks up from where she is kneeling next to Marcus. Her eyes lock onto me, blazing with irrational, misdirected fury. She cannot accept that her judgment was flawed, so she instantly reverts to her favorite coping mechanism. She blames the scapegoat. "Look at what you have done," Maya Helen yells, her voice cracking with pure delusion. "You ruined everything. You pushed him to this. If you had just signed the waiver and let this go, none of this would have happened. You came here tonight just to destroy your sister's marriage and ruin our Thanksgiving dinner." I stand up slowly. I do not raise my voice. I do not react to her delusional accusations. I simply smooth out the invisible wrinkles on my deep emerald green dress and reach for my tailored wool coat draped over the back of my chair. I slip my arms into the sleeves, adjusting my collar with absolute unwavering calm. I look down at the three of them, a family that sold their souls for an aesthetic that never truly existed. Your golden boy just assaulted your daughter, shoved your husband into a wall, and openly admitted to defrauding you out of millions, I say, my voice ringing out cold and sharp in the ruined room. He used your desperation for white validation to rob you blind, and you are still sitting on the floor trying to blame me. I pick up my designer handbag and step carefully over the shattered crystal and spilled wine. I pause right at the grand archway of the dining room, looking back at them one last time. The 30-day notice expires on Monday. Pack your bags. The weekend passed in a tense, frozen silence. By late Sunday night, the reality of the impending Monday morning foreclosure deadline hung over the city like a suffocating shroud. I spent my evening at the office finalizing the transfer documents for the estate and preparing the formal eviction notices. I was not going to give my parents or my sister a single hour of leniency. They had made their choices. Now the consequences were knocking at the door. I pulled my Mercedes into the private underground parking garage of my penthouse building just past midnight. The concrete cavern was completely deserted, illuminated only by the harsh flickering glare of fluorescent overhead lights. My tires echoed loudly in the vast empty space. I killed the engine, gathered my briefcase, and stepped out into the damp chill of the subterranean level. Before I could even lock my car doors, a shadow detached itself from the concrete pillar near the VIP elevator bank. Maya, wait. I spun around, my hand instinctively dropping to the pepper spray clipped to my keychain. Julian stumbled out of the darkness. The sight of him was jarring. The immaculate, untouchable Wall Street finance bro who had terrorized my dining room just 3 days ago was entirely gone. His bespoke navy suit jacket was missing. His expensive dress shirt was untucked, stained with sweat, and smelling strongly of stale bourbon and sheer terror. He looked like a man who had not slept or bathed since he stormed out of my parents' house on Thanksgiving. Somehow, he had sneaked past my building concierge, likely tailgating another resident's vehicle through the security gates. He rushed toward me, his hands raised in a frantic gesture of surrender. "Please, Maya, just listen to me for 1 minute," Julian begged, his voice cracking with a pathetic, high-pitched desperation. "I need you to listen to me." I did not back away, but I kept my grip tight on my keys. "You are trespassing, Julian. If you take one more step toward me, I am pressing the panic button on my key fob and having you arrested." He stopped immediately. To my absolute astonishment, his knees buckled. The golden boy of the country club, the man who had demanded my parents worship the ground he walked on, dropped directly onto the cold, grease-stained concrete floor of the parking garage. "I am begging you," Julian cried, his chest heaving as tears streamed down his dirt-smudged face. "You have to halt the foreclosure tomorrow morning. You have to give me the house back. You have no idea what is actually happening. The money I moved offshore, it did not just disappear into bad investments. I borrowed capital from the wrong people to cover my margins. Dangerous people, Maya. Loan sharks operating through overseas syndicates. They are looking for me right now. If I do not liquidate that estate and hand them the equity by the end of the week, they are going to kill me. They know where I live. They know where your parents live." I looked down at him, kneeling in the dirt. I felt absolutely nothing. No pity, no sympathy, just a cold, clinical observation of a predator caught in a trap of his own making. "Your gambling debts with international criminals are not my problem," I said, my voice echoing sharply off the concrete walls. "You used your white privilege to blind my parents, convincing them you were a financial genius while you were actually running a glorified Ponzi scheme. You drained the equity of black homeowners to fund your fraudulent lifestyle. You dug this grave yourself, Julian. Now you get to lie in it alone. I am foreclosing on the property at 9 in the morning." Julian stared up at me, his frantic weeping grinding to an abrupt halt. The desperate, pathetic facade melted away, replaced by the cornered, vicious snake I knew him to be. He scrambled to his feet, wiping his face with the back of his trembling hand. He took a threatening step forward, cornering me against the driver's side door of my car. "You think you hold all the cards?" He sneered, his breath reeking of alcohol. "You think you are going to just walk away clean and watch me burn? You are forgetting one crucial detail, Maya. Your precious sister." I kept my expression entirely neutral. "What does Chloe have to do with your offshore debt?" "Everything." Julian spat, a malicious grin twisting his face. "You think she just blindly spent the money? When I set up the shell companies in the Cayman Islands, I needed a secondary corporate officer to bypass the domestic flag triggers. Chloe signed the incorporation papers. She signed the tax returns. I have digital copies of everything stored on a secure server. She is legally complicit in wire fraud, tax evasion, and international money laundering. He leaned in closer, attempting to physically intimidate me with his height. Here is the deal, Maya, Julian hissed. You cancel the foreclosure tomorrow and transfer the deed of the house back into my name so I can sell it to pay off my creditors. If you try to ruin me, I am taking all those signed documents straight to the federal prosecutors. I will take a plea deal for cooperating, and I will drag your beautiful golden child sister to federal prison with me. Let us see how much your parents love you when you are the reason their favorite daughter is locked in a cage for the next 20 years. He stood back, crossing his arms, waiting for me to break. He expected me to panic, to cry, to frantically negotiate to save my family from absolute destruction. I did not even blink. I smoothly reached into the pocket of my tailored wool coat and pulled out my smartphone. I held it up between us, the screen facing him. The display was glowing with a bright red circle indicating an active voice recording. The timer showed I had been recording for the last 4 minutes, capturing every single word since he stepped out from behind the concrete pillar. Julian's face drained of all color. His eyes locked onto the pulsating red dot. Extortion is a federal offense, Julian. I said, my voice as cold and hard as a diamond. And you just confessed to tax evasion, wire fraud, and international money laundering on tape. You also just admitted to deliberately defrauding my sister. No, Julian gasped, stumbling backward as if the phone was a loaded gun. Maya, wait. I tapped the screen, ending the recording. I opened my email application, attached the audio file, and typed in the direct address for the FBI white-collar crime tip line. I had saved the contact information weeks ago when Kendra and I first began investigating his fraudulent wire transfers. I looked him dead in the eyes. I do not negotiate with terrorists. I hit send right in front of his face. The email whooshed away into cyberspace. Julian let out a guttural, horrifying sound, a mix between a scream and a sob. He realized in an instant that his leverage was gone, his freedom was forfeited, and his life as he knew it was entirely over. He spun around, nearly tripping over his own feet, and sprinted blindly toward the emergency exit stairwell, fleeing into the freezing night like a cornered rat. The echo of Julian's frantic footsteps faded into the concrete stairwell, leaving me alone in the freezing parking garage. I did not chase him. Predators do not need to run when the trap has already snapped shut. I walked calmly to the elevator, my pulse as steady as a metronome. I had sent the audio file to the federal authorities, but I still had one final obligation to fulfill. It was not born out of love, but out of a rigid sense of duty that I was about to extinguish forever. The next morning, the winter sun offered no warmth as I pulled my Mercedes up the winding circular driveway of the family estate, the very house I legally owned. The grand facade looked absurd, now a hollow monument to a lie my parents had mortgaged their souls to protect. I bypassed the ornate brass knocker and used the emergency keypad code I had memorized years ago. The heavy door clicked open. I found Marcus, Helen, and Chloe gathered in the formal living room. The atmosphere was incredibly suffocating. Marcus was nursing a glass of scotch at 9 in the morning, his face pale and sunken. Helen sat rigidly on the velvet sofa, staring at the muted television screen. Chloe paced the length of the Persian rug, clutching her phone as if waiting for a miracle that would never arrive. They all froze when I stepped into the room. Helen immediately stood up, her jaw tightening as she prepared to launch into another tirade about my lack of respect for their privacy. I did not give her the chance to speak. Sit down, Helen. I commanded, my voice carrying an authority that brooked absolutely zero defiance. I am only going to say this once, and I suggest you all listen very carefully, because your entire future depends on the next 5 minutes. I walked to the center of the room, pulled my smartphone from my tailored coat pocket, and placed it flat on the glass coffee table. I tapped the screen and hit play. Julian's panicked, frantic voice filled the pristine living room. The pristine audio captured every single word of his pathetic ambush in my parking garage. They heard him confess to the offshore accounts. They heard him admit to funneling the equity out of their home to pay off international loan sharks. But the most devastating blow came when his voice echoed his threat against Chloe, explicitly detailing how he had used her signature to commit tax evasion and international money laundering. They heard him boldly declare that he would take his own wife to federal prison with him just to save his own skin. I stopped the recording. The silence that followed was heavy enough to crush bone. Marcus stared at the phone, his hands shaking so violently he had to set his scotch glass down on the side table before he dropped it. Chloe stopped pacing. Her pristine facade crumbled, and she sank onto the armrest of the sofa, her mouth opening and closing as she struggled to process the sheer magnitude of her husband's betrayal. "Hi is gone," I stated, looking directly at my sister. "Julian fled the city last night. The FBI already has that recording. Federal agents are likely pulling his banking records right now. He is going to be indicted, and when they realize your signature is on those Cayman Island Incorporation documents, Chloe, they are going to come for you next." Chloe gasped, covering her mouth with her hands. I turned my attention to my parents. "I hold the legal deed to this house, and the foreclosure notice is active. You have absolutely nothing left. Your golden boy bankrupted you, assaulted you, and fled. But I am giving you one final choice. I am offering you a lifeline you absolutely do not deserve." I reached into my briefcase and pulled out a manila folder, tossing it onto the table next to the phone. Inside that folder is a cooperation agreement drafted by my attorney. If you take this to the federal prosecutors today, if you turn state's evidence against Julian and testify about his fraud, I will intervene. I will use my legal team to protect Chloe from prison time by proving she was a coerced pawn. Furthermore, I will purchase a modest 2-bedroom apartment across town and pay the lease for exactly 1 year so you are not out on the street. But you have to abandon this fake high society life today. You have to admit the truth to yourselves, to the authorities, and to your country club friends. I waited for the reality to sink in. I expected tears. I expected apologies. I expected a shred of gratitude for offering a parachute to people who had spent my entire life trying to drown me. Instead, Helen stepped forward. Her face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. She raised her hand and delivered a vicious, stinging slap directly across my left cheek. The sharp crack echoed loudly in the quiet room. My head snapped to the side from the sheer force of the impact. "You set him up!" Helen screamed, her voice shrill and hysterical. "You pushed Julian to this because you are a bitter, lonely woman who cannot stand to see anyone else happy. You probably doctored that recording just to frame him. Julian would never do this to us. He is a respected finance executive. You are just trying to tear this family apart because you are jealous of your sister." I slowly turned my head back to face her. The stinging heat on my cheek was nothing compared to the absolute glacial coldness flooding my veins. I looked at Marcus. He averted his eyes, staring at the floor, too cowardly to defend the truth or his own daughter. I looked at Chloe. She stood up, crossing her arms defensively, aligning herself perfectly with our mother's delusion. "Mom is right," Chloe spat, her chin jutting out in stubborn arrogance. "Julian is just under a lot of stress because you are threatening to take our house. He is going to secure the offshore funds and come back for me. He is going to hire the best lawyers in the country and put you in your place. I am not turning on my husband just so you can feel superior, Maya. You are just a sad, miserable person." I stood perfectly still. I raised my hand and gently touched my stinging cheek. The physical pain evaporated, instantly replaced by a profound, unshakable clarity. For 32 years, I had held on to a tiny, fragile thread of hope that one day my family would see my worth. One day they would realize I was the daughter who actually protected them. In that single moment, the thread did not just snap. It disintegrated into dust. All remaining familial warmth, every ounce of loyalty, every shred of genetic obligation, died a permanent death right there in the living room. I looked at the three of them, seeing them not as my parents or my sister, but as strangers who had chosen their own destruction over reality. "I tried to save you from yourselves," I said, my voice completely devoid of emotion. It was flat, hollow, and final. "We are done." I picked up my phone and the manila folder from the glass table. I did not wait for a response. I turned my back on them and walked purposefully toward the grand entryway. I pulled open the heavy front door and stepped out into the freezing winter air, leaving the grand estate behind me forever. As I walked down the sweeping driveway toward my car, I unlocked my phone screen and dialed my attorney. She answered on the very first ring. Kendra, I said, staring at the massive brick facade of the house. File the foreclosure. Fast-track it through the county clerk. I want them out by Friday. Friday morning arrived with a biting wind that cut straight to the bone, a fitting weather forecast for the death of an illusion. The wide concrete steps of the county courthouse were already swarming with people by 8 in the morning. Real estate vultures, corporate developers and bargain hunters hovered around the large bulletin boards, clutching their hot coffees and cashier checks. They were waiting for the morning foreclosure auctions to begin, ready to pick the meat off the bones of failed American dreams. I stood near the back of the crowd, wrapped in a heavy charcoal wool coat, my hands tucked deep into my pockets. I blended in perfectly with the investors. Across the stone courtyard, huddled near a concrete pillar, stood Marcus, Helen, and Chloe. The transformation was staggering. Just a few days ago, they had been lounging in a multi-million-dollar estate, dripping in designer labels and drinking expensive wine. Now stripped of their fraudulent wealth, they looked incredibly small. Helen wore an outdated generic winter jacket she must have dug out of storage. Marcus looked physically shrunken, his shoulders bowed under the weight of utter public humiliation. They were shivering, glancing nervously at the wealthy strangers surrounding them. Chloe was frantically pacing back and forth along the edge of the steps, clutching her phone to her chest. She kept rising on her tiptoes, desperately scanning the sea of faces, searching the street for a familiar luxury car. She was still waiting for Julian. She actually believed her white knight was going to pull up at the 11th hour, jump out of a sleek vehicle with a briefcase full of offshore cash, and save her from the consequences of her own blinding arrogance. But Julian was a ghost. He had taken the last of their liquid cash and vanished into thin air, leaving his beloved wife to face the music entirely alone. The county clerk stepped out onto the top landing carrying a clipboard and a portable microphone. A hush fell over the crowd of investors. The auction was officially commencing. Chloe finally stopped pacing. Her eyes darted through the crowd and locked onto me. For a second, her face contorted with the usual defensive rage, but the sight of the auctioneer stepping up to the microphone shattered whatever remained of her stubborn pride. Panic seized her entirely. She shoved her way through the tight cluster of bidders, nearly tripping over her own boots, and practically collided with me. Maya, Chloe gasped, her voice trembling and raw. Tears streamed freely down her face, ruining her hastily applied makeup. Maya, you have to stop this. Please, you have to buy it back right now. I looked down at her. She reached out and grabbed the sleeve of my coat, her fingers digging into the wool. The golden child. The sister who had just 2 days ago called me a sad, miserable person was now openly sobbing in a public courtyard, begging the family scapegoat for salvation. Julian is not coming, is not he? Chloe choked out, finally giving voice to the terrifying reality she had been denying all week. He blocked my number. His lawyer will not return my calls. We have absolutely nowhere to go, Maya. Mom and Dad spent their last dollar on movers to put our things in a cheap storage unit. We slept in a motel last night. A motel. You cannot let some random stranger take the house. Place a bid. You have the money. Buy it back and we will rent it from you. I will get a job. I will pay you every month, I swear on my life. Just raise your hand. I looked at her desperate, tear-stained face. I thought about the decades of emotional abuse. I thought about the time she paraded her stolen wealth in my face, using my own money to fund her fake influencer lifestyle. I thought about my parents standing 10 feet away, too cowardly to even approach me themselves, sending their broken favorite child to do their begging. The auctioneer cleared his throat. The microphone screeched briefly before his voice boomed over the courtyard. Next item on the docket. Case number 482. The residential estate located at 1045 Highland Drive. Marcus flinched visibly. Helen buried her face in her hands, unable to watch their ultimate status symbol be announced like a cheap commodity. We have an opening bid of $200,000, the clerk announced. The number was a complete insult. It was a fraction of what the property was actually worth, but distressed sales always drew the sharks. Do I hear 210? The clerk called out. Chloe tugged violently on my sleeve. Maya, please, she sobbed, her voice cracking loudly enough for several investors to turn and stare. Please raise your hand. I am begging you. I am your sister. 210 to the gentleman in the gray suit, the clerk shouted, pointing to a ruthless-looking corporate developer standing near the front. Do I hear 220? I stood perfectly still. I kept my hands buried deep inside the pockets of my wool coat. I did not move a single muscle. 220, the clerk acknowledged, another bidder. Chloe shook my arm, her panic turning into sheer hysteria. Maya, what are you doing? Bid. Raise your hand right now. They are stealing it for pennies. Save the house. 250,000, the corporate developer in the gray suit barked out, his voice sharp and final. The crowd went silent. It was a low-ball, devastating victory. The developer smirked, knowing he had just secured a massive piece of prime real estate for absolute pocket change. Going once at 250,000, the clerk announced. Going twice. No, Chloe screamed, her voice tearing through the cold morning air. I calmly leaned forward, closing the distance between us, until my lips were merely an inch from my sister's ear. I did not come to buy it, I whispered, my voice as frigid as the winter wind. I came to watch it go. Sold, the auctioneer yelled. The heavy wooden gavel slammed down against the podium with a sharp, echoing crack. The sound signaled the absolute, irreversible end of my family's fraudulent empire. Chloe collapsed against me, her legs giving out completely as the reality of her total ruin set in. I stepped back, letting her drop to her knees on the cold concrete. Marcus and Helen stared at the auctioneer in mute, devastating horror. Their country club membership, their generational wealth, their proximity to white power had all just been auctioned off to a stranger in a gray suit for absolute pennies. But the universe was not finished collecting its debts. Before Chloe could even catch her breath, the sudden aggressive screech of heavy tires shattered the remaining quiet of the courtyard. 3 massive black, unmarked SUVs aggressively mounted the curb of the courthouse square, blocking the pedestrian exits. The doors flew open in unison. 10 men and women wearing tactical vests with the letters FBI emblazoned across their chests swarmed out of the vehicles. The crowd of investors instantly scattered, parting like the Red Sea to make way for the federal agents. The lead agent, a tall, imposing man with a stern face, marched directly toward the concrete pillar. Marcus Hayes, the agent, shouted, his voice booming with unquestionable authority. Chloe Hayes, stand exactly where you are and keep your hands where I can see them. The panic that seized my father and sister was instantaneous and visceral. 2 federal agents moved with terrifying precision, bypassing the shocked crowd of real estate investors to flank Marcus and Chloe. Before either of them could utter a single word of defense, heavy steel handcuffs were ratcheted around their wrists. The sharp metallic clicks echoed across the stone courtyard, cutting through the freezing morning air. Helen shrieked, lunging forward to grab her husband by his coat, but a third agent firmly blocked her path, instructing her to step back or face immediate obstruction charges. Marcus looked completely bewildered, his eyes darting frantically as an agent read him his Miranda rights in front of the very people he used to golf with. Chloe completely lost whatever remained of her composure. She began thrashing against the agent, holding her arms, screaming that she was a victim, that her husband was a wealthy finance executive, and that they were making a massive mistake. The agents ignored her entitled tantrums entirely. They marched my father and sister down the concrete steps, forcing them into the back of the waiting black SUVs. I watched from my vantage point as the heavy doors slammed shut. The vehicles tore away from the curb, sirens blaring, leaving my mother standing entirely alone on the freezing courthouse steps. She sank to her knees, weeping hysterically into her hands, completely stripped of her country club dignity. I did not walk over to comfort her. I simply turned on my heel, hailed a waiting town car, and headed straight for the federal building, inside the sterile, heavily guarded confines of the local FBI field office. The atmosphere was a stark contrast to the chaos outside. I sat comfortably at a sleek metal table in a soundproof conference room, sipping black coffee from a paper cup. Sitting across from me was Special Agent Reynolds, the lead investigator on the Financial Fraud Task Force. Spread across the table between us was a massive, meticulously organized dossier. It was the crowning achievement of my career as a property appraiser and the ultimate weapon I had forged over the past 3 years. When Julian first bounced that mortgage check, I did not just buy the debt to save my parents' ungrateful hides. I used the resources of my holding company, Apex Holdings, to dig into the routing numbers. My network of real estate title agents, forensic accountants, and offshore property trackers had spent 36 months quietly mapping every single shell company Julian created. I tracked the fraudulent loans he secured against minority-owned businesses. I traced the equity he stripped from black families, desperate for a financial lifeline. I handed the federal government the entire roadmap to his international money laundering operation on a silver platter. I had not just caught Julian, I had mathematically dissected his entire criminal empire, exposing the predatory lending practices he used to build his fake white savior persona. Agent Reynolds tapped the interrogation rooms. I could see the live feeds of my father and sister. They were in separate rooms, sitting under harsh fluorescent lights, looking absolutely terrified. An agent slid the guarantor documents and incorporation papers across the metal table to Marcus. I watched my father visibly deflate as he recognized his own signature, binding him to Julian failing hedge fund. In the adjacent feed, Chloe was hyperventilating, staring at the tax returns she had blindly signed to funnel stolen money into the Cayman Islands. They were legally on the hook for millions in stolen federal funds. They were staring down the barrel of serious prison time. I leaned forward, folding my hands on the table. "You and I both know they are not the masterminds here," I told Agent Reynolds, my voice calm and analytical. "They are arrogant, status-obsessed, and completely financially illiterate. They signed those documents because they were desperate to buy proximity to white wealth. They lacked the fundamental intelligence required to orchestrate a multi-million-dollar international wire fraud syndicate. They were nothing but oblivious pawns who wanted to brag about their luxury lifestyle on social media." Agent Reynolds reviewed the secondary evidence I had provided, a series of email exchanges proving Julian deliberately hid the true nature of the documents from them. "You built a very compelling defense for them, Maya. Based on your dossier, the Department of Justice is willing to offer them a deal. We will decline to press criminal conspiracy charges. They will avoid federal prison. However, the financial penalties are absolute. The IRS will be seizing every remaining asset they possess. They will be hit with massive fraud fines, tax penalties, and restitution orders that will garnish whatever meager income they generate for the rest of their natural lives. They are walking out of here today, but they are leaving in absolute inescapable ruin." I watched my sister wipe her nose with the back of her hand on the security monitor. I watched my father bury his face in his arms, his posture signaling the total collapse of his pride. I had saved them from wearing a bright orange jumpsuit, but I had ensured they would never again look down on anyone from a pedestal of unearned wealth. I nodded at the agent. "That is an acceptable resolution. They get to keep their freedom, but they have to live in the specific reality they created." Before Agent Reynolds could finalize the paperwork to release them, heavy footsteps echoed loudly down the adjacent hallway. The thick metal door of the precinct swung open violently. Two federal marshals marched into the booking area, dragging a man securely restrained in heavy iron handcuffs and waist chains. It was Julian. He looked absolutely unrecognizable. His bespoke designer clothes were torn, wrinkled, and covered in dirt. He sported a massive, ugly purple bruise across his left cheekbone, and his bottom lip was split and actively bleeding. The authorities had intercepted him at a private airstrip just outside the city limits, yanking him off a chartered jet, moments before he could successfully flee the country. He thrashed against the marshal's iron grip, shouting frantic, empty threats about calling his corporate lawyers, demanding his phone, and screaming that he was a victim of circumstance. The marshals shoved him aggressively into a holding chair directly outside the conference room glass. As Julian struggled to catch his breath, his frantic, bloodshot eyes darted around the busy precinct. His gaze swept past the booking desk, past the holding cells, and finally locked directly onto the window of the conference room. He saw me sitting there with perfect posture. He saw the massive stack of financial dossiers spread across the table. I saw the lead federal agent nodding to me with deep professional respect. The fighting completely drained out of Julian's body. He slumped back in the metal chair, the horrifying realization washing over his battered face. He had constantly belittled the sister-in-law. He thought he could easily outsmart, intimidate and manipulate had brilliantly orchestrated his entire catastrophic downfall from the very beginning. 1 month later, the devastating reality of federal restitution settled over my family like a suffocating blanket. The sprawling custom-built estate with its sweeping staircase and manicured lawns was gone. Marcus, Helen, and Chloe were officially forced to relocate to a cramped two-bedroom apartment on the third floor of a deteriorating building in a rapidly gentrifying neighborhood. It was the exact type of neighborhood my parents used to lock their car doors while driving through. There were no more Sunday brunches at the country club. There were no more private tennis lessons or catered charity galas. The IRS had systematically seized their bank accounts, liquidated their retirement portfolios, and garnished whatever meager fixed income they had left to pay off the massive fraud penalties. The smell of fresh orchids and expensive candles had been replaced by the permanent stench of stale cooking oil mildew and the loud thumping bass from the downstairs neighbors. Yet even in the depths of absolute financial ruin, my sister Chloe stubbornly clung to her delusions. She refused to accept that her reign as a high society socialite was over. Standing in the middle of the cramped, poorly lit living room, Chloe desperately tried to salvage her shattered online aesthetic. She propped her smartphone against a stack of moving boxes, trying to find the perfect angle that would hide the peeling linoleum floors. She adjusted her hair, pasted on her signature fake smile, and uploaded a new photo to her Instagram feed. She wore a plain white t-shirt and jeans, captioning the post with a lengthy philosophical paragraph about embracing minimalist living, shedding the burdens of material wealth, and finding spiritual peace in a new downsized season of life. It was a pathetic, desperate attempt to control the narrative. She actually thought she could spin her federal eviction into a trendy lifestyle choice. The internet, however, is completely unforgiving. Less than 10 minutes after the post went live, the notification bell on her phone began to chime, frantically. Chloe eagerly picked up the device, expecting an outpouring of support and admiration from her loyal followers. Instead, she was met with absolute, unadulterated public humiliation. The comments section was a bloodbath. Someone had zoomed in on the top right corner of her photo, exposing a massive, ugly yellow water damage stain on the ceiling and a cheap, plastic roach trap sitting on the kitchen counter. Worse, a local blog page had already pulled the public court records. Minimalist Living 1, top comment read, "Girl, your husband is sitting in a federal holding cell for wire fraud and your parents' house got foreclosed on the courthouse steps. Stop lying to us." Another comment racked up hundreds of likes within seconds. "We saw the auction records. The feds seized your fake Hermes bags. You are living in a slum because you married a white scammer who played your entire family for fools. Welcome to reality." Chloe stared at the screen, her chest heaving as the brutal, undeniable truth washed over her in real time. The flawless, carefully curated illusion of black excellence she had weaponized against me. Her entire life was entirely dismantled by strangers on the internet. She let out a guttural, agonizing scream, hurling her smartphone directly against the cheap drywall. The screen shattered into a spiderweb of cracked glass. She dropped to her knees on the peeling linoleum, weeping hysterically, as she frantically logged back into her cracked phone, permanently deleting her social media accounts in a total catastrophic mental breakdown. Her hysterical screaming immediately drew Marcus and Helen out of the tiny kitchen. For 32 years, I had been the designated scapegoat in our family. Whenever anything went wrong, whenever the pressure of maintaining their upper-class facade became too heavy, they had directed all their toxicity, anger, and resentment squarely at me. I was the emotional dumping ground that kept their fragile ecosystem intact. But I was not there anymore. I was untouchable, living peacefully in my downtown penthouse. Without me there to absorb their poison, the toxic family dynamic instantly turned inward and they began to tear each other apart. Helen looked at her youngest daughter sobbing on the floor, and instead of offering comfort, her face twisted with bitter resentment. She rounded on Marcus, her voice sharp and vicious. "This is your fault," she shrieked, pointing an accusing finger at my father. "You were supposed to be the man of this house. You were supposed to protect us. Instead, you blindly signed every piece of paper that criminal put in front of you. You let a white con artist sweet-talk you into giving away everything we worked our entire lives to build. You made us the laughingstock of the entire city. Marcus' face flushed dark with rage. His pride, already severely wounded by the federal agents, completely snapped. "Do not you dare put this on me, Helen," he bellowed, his voice shaking the thin apartment walls. "You were the one who worshipped the ground Julian walked on. You paraded him around the country club like he was a trophy. And you," he turned his furious glare downward at Chloe, who was still hyperventilating on the floor. "You brought that parasite into our home. You were so desperate for a wealthy lifestyle that you ignored every single red flag. You signed those offshore tax returns so you could buy designer clothes, and you dragged us all straight down to hell with you. You ruined this family, Chloe." The words struck Chloe like a physical blow. The golden child, the one who could never do wrong, was suddenly bearing the full crushing weight of her parents' wrath. She looked up at Marcus and Helen, seeing the unmasked disgust in their eyes. The realization hit her with sickening clarity. They did not love her unconditionally. They only loved the status she previously provided them. Now that she was broke, she was just as useless to them as they always claimed I was. Desperation is a dangerous catalyst. It strips away all logic and reason. As Marcus and Helen continued to scream at each other, their bitter argument echoing through the tiny apartment, Chloe quietly stood up. Her eyes were vacant, her mind completely fractured by the loss of her identity. She slowly walked over to the cheap particle board entryway table where Helen had left her purse. Chloe reached inside and pulled out her mother's wallet. She bypassed the canceled credit cards and slipped out the last two crumpled $20 bills Helen had withdrawn for groceries. She clutched the stolen cash in her trembling fist. She was completely broken, completely exposed, and entirely out of options. She only knew one person who possessed the wealth and power to fix this absolute nightmare. Chloe quietly slipped out the front door, leaving her parents screaming at each other in the squalor. She walked out into the cold street, hailed a passing cab, and handed the driver the stolen cash. She gave him the address of my luxury high-rise, determined to force her older sister to fix her ruined life by any means necessary. The rain had started to fall in heavy icy sheets against the floor-to-ceiling windows of my penthouse. I was sitting at my kitchen island sipping a cup of chamomile tea and reviewing the initial demolition permits for my next affordable housing project. The security system in my building was state-of-the-art, but desperation breeds a specific type of cunning. Chloe slipped past the front desk concierge by tailgating a frazzled grocery delivery driver through the secure revolving doors. She slipped into the private elevator bank and hit the button for the top floor. The violent pounding on my front door shattered the quiet sanctuary of my evening. It was not a polite knock. It was a frantic, erratic hammering that echoed through the long hallway. I set my teacup down, checked the security camera feed on my tablet, and let out a long, measured breath. Chloe was standing outside, shivering in a thin cotton shirt, her hair wild and her face streaked with ruined makeup. She looked completely unhinged. I could have left her out there. I could have called the lobby desk and had her escorted off the premises. But I knew this confrontation was the final poison that needed to be drained from our dynamic. I unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the door open. Chloe did not wait for an invitation. She shoved her way past me, bringing the stench of stale rain and sheer panic into my pristine foyer. She paced the length of my living room, her eyes darting around the luxury furnishings, absorbing the stark contrast between my massive success and her newfound squalor. "You are going to fix this," Chloe gasped, her chest heaving as she spun around to face me. "You are going to fix it right now, Maya. You have millions of dollars sitting in your accounts. You are going to hire the best federal defense attorneys in the country for Julian. And then you are going to wire me $500,000 so I can get a new place and start over. You owe me this. You ruined my life, and you are going to put it back together." I crossed my arms, leaning casually against the marble kitchen counter. "I do not owe you a single cent, Chloe. Julian committed federal wire fraud. You signed the offshore tax returns. You bankrupted our parents to buy designer clothes and fake your way into high society. I am not subsidizing your delusions, and I am certainly not funding the legal defense of a white con artist who physically assaulted you and admitted to robbing our family blind." Chloe's face twisted into a mask of pure, desperate rage. She realized her demands were bouncing off a brick wall. The golden child, completely stripped of her enabling parents and her fraudulent husband, reached for the most toxic weapon left in her arsenal, emotional terrorism. She sprinted toward the far end of my living room, throwing open the heavy glass doors that led out to my expansive wrap-around balcony. The freezing wind and rain whipped into the penthouse. Chloe ran out into the storm, marching straight to the edge of the glass railing that overlooked the dizzying drop to the city streets 30 floors below. "If you do not transfer the money right now, I will jump!" Chloe screamed, her voice tearing through the howling wind. She gripped the wet railing, leaning dangerously over the edge. "I will throw myself off this balcony, Maya. I will end it right here. And when the police come, I will leave a note saying you drove me to it. My blood will be on your hands forever. Mom and Dad will never forgive you. The entire world will know you let your own sister die because you were too cheap and bitter to save her." She stood there in the freezing rain, waiting for the familiar script to play out. She expected me to scream. She expected me to drop to my knees, burst into tears, and beg her to step down. She expected me to hand over my credit cards, my wealth, and my hard-earned peace just to pacify her manic demands. I did not shed a single tear. I did not raise my voice. I did not take a single step out into the storm. I walked calmly to the smart home control panel mounted on the wall next to the patio entrance. I looked my sister dead in the eyes. I pressed the automated lock command. The reinforced glass balcony doors smoothly slid shut right in front of her face, sealing with a heavy magnetic click. The howling wind and her hysterical screams were instantly muted by the soundproof glass. Chloe slammed her fists against the thick panes, her eyes wide with absolute disbelief, as she realized I had just locked her outside in the freezing rain. I pulled my smartphone from my pocket and dialed 911. The operator answered on the second ring. "My name is Maya," I stated, my voice completely steady, devoid of any panic or hesitation. "I am calling from the penthouse at 200 West Highland Avenue. My sister broke into my residence. She is currently experiencing a severe psychiatric break and is actively threatening self-harm. She ran out onto my balcony and threatened to jump. I have locked the doors to contain the situation, but she is a danger to herself. Send paramedics and police immediately." I ended the call and stood in the warmth of my living room, watching Chloe pound relentlessly against the glass. The realization crashed over her in real time. The manipulation had failed. The extortion had failed. The toxic umbilical cord tying me to her manufactured crises had been permanently severed. Within 10 minutes, the wail of approaching sirens pierced the night air. The heavy oak door of my penthouse swung open as building security escorted 2 police officers and a team of paramedics into my living room. I unlocked the balcony doors for them. Chloe tried to fight, kicking and screaming as the officers grabbed her arms. She shrieked curses at me, calling me a monster, demanding that they arrest me instead. The police recognized the erratic, violent behavior of someone in the midst of a total mental collapse. They did not hesitate. The paramedics swiftly secured her to a medical gurney, strapping her arms and legs down with heavy canvas restraints to prevent her from harming herself or anyone else. She was officially being placed under an involuntary 5150 psychiatric hold. They rolled the gurney toward the front door. Chloe strained against the heavy straps, her face red and streaked with mascara, sobbing uncontrollably as the last shreds of her golden child identity were completely dismantled. I walked over and stood over her, looking down at the woman who had spent 32 years trying to destroy me for sport. "I am not your therapist, and I am no longer your punching bag," I said, my voice echoing with final absolute authority. "Get well soon." The heavy doors of the psychiatric transport van closed, taking my sister and the last remnants of my familial guilt away into the freezing night. I went back inside my warm penthouse, poured myself a cup of chamomile tea, and went back to work. I refused to let their chaos derail my focus for another second. 6 months later, the media circus surrounding the federal courthouse was absolutely deafening. News vans lined the downtown streets, satellite dishes pointed toward the gray morning sky, and aggressive reporters clamored for any scrap of sensational information. The trial of Julian had become a national obsession. The headlines boldly branded him the Wall Street fraudster, dedicating front-page spreads to his elaborate scheme. The articles detailed his ruthless tactics of predatory lending, the creation of offshore shell companies, and the systematic draining of generational equity from minority-owned properties. The press loved the narrative of an arrogant white finance executive who had manipulated a prominent black family only to rob them blind and attempt to flee the country. Inside the federal courtroom, the atmosphere was clinical cold and entirely unforgiving. The expansive gallery was packed shoulder to shoulder with journalists, defrauded homeowners, and curious onlookers hungry for high society drama. I was not sitting in the crowded gallery. I was waiting patiently in a sequestered witness room down the hall, drinking black coffee and intently listening to the live audio feed of the court proceedings through a small speaker. The prosecution called Marcus and Helen to the stand on the very first day. They were subpoenaed as material witnesses legally forced to testify under oath about the fraudulent guarantor documents and the offshore tax returns they had blindly endorsed. Marcus took the stand first. He wore a dated, ill-fitting gray suit completely stripped of his former country club bravado. Julian, defense attorney, a ruthless shark, desperate to shift the criminal blame, tore into my father with surgical precision. The defense painted Marcus not as a naive victim, but as a willing participant who deliberately turned a blind eye to massive criminal activity in exchange for social status. "Is it not true, Mr. Hayes," the defense attorney boomed, pacing aggressively in front of the captivated jury box, "that you signed these commercial guarantor documents without consulting a financial advisor because you were absolutely desperate to maintain the illusion of wealth? You were deeply in debt long before my client arrived, were you not?" Marcus stammered into the microphone, his hands trembling visibly on the wooden railing. "I trusted him. He was my son-in-law. He worked on Wall Street. He said he was managing our investment portfolio." "You trusted his race and his perceived social status," the attorney corrected sharply. "We have subpoenaed your bank records. You were 60 days behind on your country club dues. You had maxed out 4 separate premium credit cards just to maintain your luxury vehicles and fund your extravagant dinner parties. You saw a wealthy white finance executive and you practically handed him the keys to your estate because you desperately craved the validation he brought to your social circle. You did not read the fine print because you were too busy bragging about his pedigree to your neighbors." Marcus looked down at his lap, thoroughly humiliated in front of the entire federal court. His pristine, manufactured image of black excellence was brutally exposed as a hollow, debt-ridden sham built entirely on lies and insecurity. Helen was called to the stand next. She looked incredibly frail and defeated, her face completely devoid of the arrogant smirk she had worn for 3 decades. The defense attorney showed absolutely no mercy, hammering her relentlessly with printed emails, proving she had actively ignored multiple glaring warnings about Julian's erratic financial behavior. "Mrs. Hayes, you received a certified notice from the bank 2 years ago, warning of suspicious offshore transfers related to your home equity line of credit," the attorney stated. "Why did you not report this immediately? Why did you deliberately hide this urgent notice from your accountant?" Helen gripped the edges of the wooden witness stand. Tears began to stream down her face, and for the first time in her entire life, they were not manipulative or weaponized. They were born of absolute, crushing, undeniable public shame. "I did not want people to know," Helen sobbed, her voice breaking over the microphone. The gallery went dead silent. "I did not want my friends to think we had made a mistake. Chloe was finally married to a successful man. We had the grand estate and the perfect lifestyle. Whenever I saw a red flag, I buried it. I ignored it because I just wanted to brag about him. I wanted everyone to be jealous of what we had. I sacrificed everything just to keep up appearances." She buried her face in her hands, weeping openly. Julian sat at the defense table, sneering at her, devoid of any remorse. He thought his lawyer had successfully muddied the waters. By making my parents look like greedy, willing accomplices, the defense was attempting to create reasonable doubt about Julian's role as the sole mastermind of the fraud. Julian leaned back in his heavy leather chair, convinced he had just secured a mistrial or a drastically reduced sentence. The defense attorney smirked and returned to his seat. "No further questions, Your Honor." The lead federal prosecutor stood up calmly, buttoning his suit jacket. He was unfazed by the aggressive defense strategy. He knew that destroying my parents' character did not erase the hard mathematical evidence of Julian international money laundering. The prosecutor walked to the center of the courtroom. "Your Honor, the prosecution calls our final witness for the day, To fully trace the convoluted web of real estate fraud, predatory lending, and offshore embezzlement, the defendant committed, we require a subject matter expert. We call our star expert witness to the stand. The heavy wooden double doors at the back of the courtroom swung open with a resounding dramatic thud. The packed gallery turned in unison. Julian's smug expression instantly vanished, replaced by a look of sheer unadulterated terror. I walked through the doors wearing a perfectly tailored charcoal power suit, my heels clicking sharply against the polished marble floor. I held a sleek leather briefcase containing the absolute destruction of his entire life. I walked down the aisle exuding absolute power and unwavering professionalism, ready to finish exactly what I started. He thought he could outsmart a black woman today. I was going to teach him a brutal lesson in justice. I raised my right hand, swearing to tell the whole truth, and took my seat in the witness box. The lead federal prosecutor approached the podium, guiding the attention of the jury to the massive digital display screens mounted across the courtroom. For the next 2 hours, I did not just testify. I delivered a ruthless masterclass in forensic property appraisal and financial tracking. Every single piece of evidence I presented was a nail in the coffin of his manufactured success. I did not just provide a testimony. I provided an absolute financial autopsy of his crimes. I broke down complex banking jargon into brutal, undeniable facts, painting a crystal-clear picture of Julian's systemic theft. I walked the jurors through the creation of his offshore shell company, Horizon Ventures. I explained exactly how predatory lending practices operate, detailing how Julian specifically targeted minority-owned homes in rapidly gentrifying neighborhoods across the city. He would identify black families who possessed high property equity but craved elite social validation. He swooped in with his tailored suits and Wall Street pedigree, offering fraudulent refinancing deals and emergency loans only to bury predatory clauses deep within the fine print. I pulled up the appraisal reports I had meticulously compiled over the last 3 years. I showed the jury the exact paper trail of how Julian artificially inflated property values to secure massive secondary loans, pocketing the cash, and leaving the unsuspecting homeowners to default. When the prosecutor asked for a specific example of this exploitation, I did not flinch. I pulled up the deed to my parents' former estate. I explained how Julian promised Marcus and Helen a $150,000 bailout, only to bounce the check and use their forged signatures to secure a massive line of credit for his failing hedge fund. I exposed how he used his own wife, my sister Chloe, as a naive signatory to funnel the stolen equity into the Cayman Islands. Julian sat at the defense table, his hands shackled to his waist chain, completely paralyzed by the sheer volume of evidence. The arrogant smirk that had defined his entire existence was permanently erased. He glared at me with a toxic, impotent rage, his jaw clenched so tightly I thought his teeth might shatter. He could not say a single word. He was entirely powerless, forced to listen as I mathematically dismantled his fake white savior persona. I did not look away from him. I held his gaze the entire time, letting him feel the full, crushing weight of his inferiority. In the front row of the gallery, Marcus and Helen sat absolutely frozen. My mother, who had spent my entire life calling me a cynical, bitter disappointment, watched with wide eyes as the federal judge and the entire jury hung on my every word. My father, who had proudly paraded Julian around his country club while dismissing my career as a lowly property manager, was forced to witness my absolute brilliance. They saw me command the federal courtroom with an effortless, undeniable authority they had always claimed I lacked. For years, they had diminished my achievements to elevate him. Now, in the stark, unforgiving light of the federal justice system, the hierarchy was permanently reversed. They were completely irrelevant, and I was the orchestrator of their reality. They had to sit in their cheap, outdated clothes and listen to the daughter they threw away expertly dissect the financial ruin they had blindly walked into. They finally realized that I was the actual embodiment of the black excellence they had spent their entire lives pretending to possess. I was not yelling. I was not throwing a tantrum like Chloe. I was dismantling their golden idol with cold, hard facts. The defense attorney attempted a hostile cross-examination, trying desperately to paint me as a disgruntled, jealous family member with a personal vendetta. It was a pathetic, transparent strategy. I countered every leading question with objective data citing specific dates, SWIFT codes, and recorded offshore transfer logs. I left the high-priced corporate lawyer stuttering, sweating, and frantically checking his notes. The defense attorney realized he was entirely outmatched by someone who knew the real estate market significantly better than he did. He retreated to his desk in absolute defeat. When I was finally dismissed from the stand, the entire energy of the courtroom had drastically shifted. The prosecution rested its case immediately. The closing arguments were swift and brutal. The jury was instructed on the charges and sent out to deliberate. Usually, federal financial fraud cases of this magnitude require days of intense deliberation to sort through the paperwork. This jury did not even need a full hour. Less than 45 minutes later, the bailiff announced that a verdict had been reached. The courtroom scrambled to a standing position as the judge took the bench. Marcus and Helen gripped each other's hands, their faces pale and slick with nervous sweat. Julian stood beside his defeated lawyer, his knees visibly shaking against the defense table. The foreperson of the jury stood up holding the printed verdict sheet. Count 1 wire fraud, guilty. Count 2 extortion, guilty. Count 3 international money laundering, guilty. The foreperson read down the extensive list with a steady, unwavering voice. Guilty on all 18 counts. Julian's legs finally gave out. He collapsed heavily into his leather chair, burying his face in his shackled hands. A collective gasp rippled through the packed gallery, followed by the muffled, relieved sobs of the minority families he had systematically defrauded. The judge looked down from the elevated bench, his expression entirely devoid of mercy. Julian Vance, you used your position of corporate privilege to systematically prey upon vulnerable communities. The judge stated, his voice echoing with absolute finality. You orchestrated a malicious, calculated scheme of financial devastation to fund a fraudulent lifestyle, manipulating the very family that trusted you. Given the severe magnitude of your crimes, your total lack of remorse, and your attempted flight from justice, I see absolutely no grounds for leniency today. The judge raised his heavy wooden gavel high into the air. I sentence you to 15 years in a federal penitentiary with no possibility of early parole. The heavy gavel struck the sounding block with a deafening, satisfying crack. The sharp echo of the judge's gavel signaled the absolute end of the illusion. Julian collapsed forward, his forehead hitting the defense table as federal marshals moved in to flank him. The gallery erupted into a chaotic symphony of overlapping voices, reporters rushing toward the aisles and defrauded homeowners shedding tears of vindicated relief. I did not stay to watch them place the chains around Julian's wrists. I had already seen enough. Kendra calmly snapped her briefcase shut, adjusting the lapels of her crimson suit. We turned and walked down the center aisle of the courtroom, our heels clicking in perfect unison against the polished hardwood floor. The crowd parted for us automatically. They recognized exactly who held the power in this room. I pushed open the heavy double doors, stepping out into the expansive, brightly lit marble hallway of the federal courthouse. The air out here was cool and smelled faintly of floor wax and old paper. I took a deep breath, feeling the suffocating weight of the past 3 years completely evaporate from my shoulders. Maya, wait. Please wait. The desperate, trembling voice echoed down the long corridor. I stopped and turned slowly. Marcus and Helen were practically stumbling out of the courtroom doors, rushing toward me with an urgency I had never seen them display for anything other than a country club gala. They looked entirely broken. The arrogance that had defined their posture for my entire life was completely gone, replaced by a hollow, frantic desperation. Helen had ruined her carefully applied makeup. Dark streaks of mascara ran down her cheeks, and her hands shook violently as she closed the distance between us. Marcus trailed slightly behind her, his shoulders slumped, his eyes refusing to meet the gaze of the passing journalists. They stopped a few feet away from me. Kendra stepped slightly forward, instinctively positioning herself as a protective barrier, but I gently touched her arm. I did not need protection from these two people anymore. They were completely disarmed. Helen let out a ragged, ugly sob. She lunged forward, throwing her arms out desperately, attempting to pull me into a tight maternal embrace. I took one smooth, deliberate step backward. Her arms grasped nothing but empty air. Helen stumbled, catching her balance, looking at me with wide, shocked eyes. Maya, she wept, her voice cracking with raw emotion. You saved us. You kept us out of federal prison. We were so incredibly wrong about everything. We see it now. We see your worth now. Please let us just go home and be a family again. We can fix this. We can start over. I stared at the woman who had birthed me. I looked at the tears streaming down her face, the pleading expression, the absolute destruction of her pride. A decade ago, I would have given anything to hear those words. I would have sacrificed my own sanity just to feel her arms wrap around me, to hear her acknowledge my value. But standing in the cold marble hallway of the courthouse, looking at her desperate tears, I felt absolutely nothing. The well had completely run dry. You do not see my worth. Helen? I said, my voice completely flat and devoid of any familial warmth. You just see that I won. Helen flinched as if I had physically struck her across the face. You do not get to abuse me for 30 years. I continued my words, cutting through the echoing hallway with surgical precision. You do not get to call me a bitter, jealous spinster in my own home. You do not get to weaponize my sister against me, mock my career, and blindly worship a white con artist who was actively stealing your generational wealth. You spent my entire life shoving me into the shadows so your golden child could shine. You do not get to do all of that, and then suddenly claim me as your beloved daughter, only when I am the one holding all the power. But we are your parents! Marcus interjected, his voice trembling with a pathetic attempt at asserting his patriarchal authority. We made terrible mistakes, Maya. We were blinded by the aesthetics, by the promises Julian made. But we are blood. You proved today that you are the strongest person in this family. We need you. Chloe needs you. Her husband is going to prison and we have absolutely nothing left. Let me make amends. Let me be the father you deserve. I am begging you. I looked at Marcus. I remembered the day I bought my first commercial property, how I had invited him to dinner to celebrate, and how he had spent the entire evening bragging about Julian's new luxury vehicle instead. I remembered the sneer on his face when he told me I was ruining their anniversary party. You do not want to be a father, Marcus, I stated coldly. You just want a new savior. You want me to step into the role Julian vacated. You want me to pay your rent, fund your lifestyle, and shield you from the consequences of your own blinding ignorance. You want me to fix Chloe's shattered life, because you do not have the capacity to do it yourself. You are not looking for redemption. You are looking for a bailout. Helen let out another loud sob, covering her face with her hands. Maya, please, you cannot just abandon us. I already did, I replied. The moment you slapped me across the face for trying to warn you, I stopped being your daughter. I am just the real estate expert who kept you out of a federal penitentiary. My debt to you is paid in full. I reached into the inner pocket of my tailored blazer and pulled out a crisp white business card. I held it out between my index and middle finger. Marcus hesitated before slowly reaching out and taking it with a shaking hand. He looked down at the embossed lettering. It was the contact information for one of the most reputable intensive family trauma therapists in the city. If you want to heal, start there, I told them, my voice ringing with absolute unshakable finality. But you will do it without me. I did not wait for their response. I did not look back to see the devastation on their faces. I simply turned on my heel and walked down the long, sweeping marble corridor toward the exit. Kendra walked right beside me, our footsteps echoing loudly against the stone walls, completely drowning out the sound of Helen weeping behind us. I pushed open the heavy glass doors of the courthouse and stepped out into the crisp, bright afternoon air, leaving the toxic remnants of my biological family behind me forever. I never looked back, as the heavy glass doors swung shut behind me. 6 months passed since that crisp afternoon at the federal courthouse, and the bitter winter air had long surrendered to the suffocating heat of a sweltering July. The passage of time cemented the absolute permanence of the new reality I had engineered. For Julian, that new reality was confined to an 8 by 10-foot concrete cell at a medium-security federal penitentiary in upstate New York. The man who once demanded perfectly tailored Italian wool suits now wore a scratchy, oversized khaki jumpsuit stamped with a black inmate identification number. There were no offshore accounts to manage, no minority homeowners to exploit, and certainly no country club sycophants to impress. His days were rigidly dictated by harsh fluorescent lights, blaring sirens, and the terrifying hierarchy of prison politics. The arrogant finance executive who had shoved my father against a credenza and threatened to destroy my life was reduced to scrubbing cafeteria trays for 30 cents an hour. He had absolutely zero possibility of early parole. He had 15 long, brutal years to reflect on the exact moment he decided to bounce a check on a black woman who knew the real estate market better than he knew himself. My sister Chloe experienced a different yet equally devastating brand of incarceration. After spending 4 grueling weeks under an involuntary psychiatric hold, she was released into a world that no longer recognized her manufactured royalty. Her designer wardrobe had been entirely liquidated by federal agents to pay down her outstanding IRS fines. Without Julian's stolen money to fund her lifestyle, Chloe was forced to enter the actual workforce for the very first time in her 29 years of existence. She secured the only job willing to hire an applicant with a blank resume and a pending federal fraud association. She became a night shift cashier at a discount grocery store. The golden child who used to post flawless, high-definition photos of luxury vacations and $20,000 bags now wore a stiff, unflattering polyester polo shirt in neon green. A plastic name tag pinned crookedly to her chest simply read Chloe in bold black letters. She spent her nights standing behind a scratched conveyor belt, scanning discounted canned goods and bagging produce. The ultimate crushing blow to her fragile ego occurred whenever former high society acquaintances happened to stop in for late-night snacks. They would recognize her whisper among themselves and offer her looks of profound, devastating pity. She could not run. She had to smile, hand them their receipts, and wish them a good evening while her soul died. Marcus and Helen faced a quieter, more isolated form of absolute ruin. Their new address was a cramped, poorly ventilated 2-bedroom apartment situated directly above a noisy commercial laundromat. The walls were paper-thin, and the persistent, nauseating smell of bleach permeated everything they owned. Stripped of their stolen equity and slapped with lifelong wage garnishments, my parents were surviving strictly on their fixed Social Security checks. They spent their days sitting on a cheap, second-hand sofa staring blankly at daytime television programming. The bustling social calendar they had once worshipped was completely eradicated. The country club elite who despised nothing more than public scandal and financial failure had excised Marcus and Helen like a cancerous tumor. Their phone never rang with invitations to charity galas or elite dinner parties. They were complete social pariahs. Without me to serve as their emotional punching bag, and without Julian to idolize, they were forced to sit in the stifling silence of their tiny apartment and face each other. They had traded their eldest daughter for an illusion of grandeur, and now they had absolutely nothing left to show for it but unpaid utility bills and overwhelming regret. Meanwhile, my world expanded into a boundless, brilliant expanse of peace and unprecedented prosperity. I was thriving in ways I never thought possible when I was suffocating under their toxic expectations. By excising the malignant tumor of my biological family, I had reclaimed my mental energy and poured it entirely into my firm. Within 6 months, Apex Holdings had tripled its annual revenue. I secured massive commercial development contracts across the entire metropolitan area. The constant, agonizing tension in my shoulders disappeared completely. I no longer looked over my shoulder waiting for the next betrayal. I no longer checked my phone dreading a toxic family group chat notification or a manipulative voicemail from Helen. My phone was a tool for wealth, not a weapon against my sanity. I slept soundly every single night, waking up to the quiet, unbothered luxury of my downtown penthouse. I had built an impenetrable fortress of absolute tranquility, and no one possessed the key but me. I was sitting at my mahogany desk on a bright Tuesday morning, finalizing the operational budget for the upcoming fiscal quarter, when a notification pinged on my private monitor. It was a secure email from the corporate developer who had purchased my parents' foreclosed mansion on the courthouse steps. I clicked the attached file. It contained a series of high-resolution drone photographs. The sprawling, colonial estate with its grand sweeping staircase and pristine landscaping had been completely leveled to the ground. The demolition crews had finished their extensive work well ahead of schedule. The physical structure where I had endured decades of emotional abuse was entirely erased from the earth. The land was now an expanse of brown dirt. It was a literal blank canvas waiting for a new purpose. A second email chimed immediately after the first. I opened it and reviewed the attached legal document. I reached for my solid gold fountain pen, my lips curling into a triumphant, radiant smile. I smoothed the thick watermarked paper on my desk and signed my name on the dotted line of a massive new development contract, staring happily at the architectural blueprints that would forever change the skyline. The architectural blueprints that would forever change the skyline became a magnificent, tangible reality, 18 months later. The morning of the grand ribbon-cutting ceremony arrived with brilliant, unapologetic sunshine. The sky was a flawless, piercing blue, completely devoid of the heavy, oppressive gray clouds that had hung over this exact plot of land during the bitter winter foreclosure auction. I stood at a sleek acrylic podium, my hands resting lightly on the cool edges, looking out over the sprawling property. This was the precise footprint where my parents' sprawling colonial mansion had once stood. The grand sweeping staircase where Chloe had posed for her fake disastrous family photograph was long gone. It had been pulverized into dust and hauled away in industrial dump trucks, completely erasing the physical monument to my family blinding arrogance. In its place stood my greatest professional and personal achievement. The structure towering behind me was a brand new state-of-the-art residential housing complex. I did not just build standard affordable housing to satisfy a municipal zoning quota. I built a sanctuary. The building featured floor-to-ceiling impact windows, lush rooftop gardens, and a secure gated courtyard designed by top-tier landscape architects. The interiors boasted luxury standard amenities, from polished quartz countertops to high-speed internet access, built directly into the infrastructure of every single unit. But the true beauty of the project was its strict, unwavering purpose. This complex was specifically designed and exclusively funded to provide secure luxury standard living for single Black mothers and women actively overcoming financial abuse. I had intentionally transformed the very soil where my family had worshipped toxic white validation and predatory wealth into a fortress of protection for vulnerable women in my community. Local politicians, city council members, housing advocates, and dozens of journalists from major national news outlets crowded the manicured front lawn. Camera flashes illuminated the crisp morning air, capturing the sheer magnitude of the development. Kendra stood in the front row, wearing a sharp-tailored white suit, beaming with immense pride alongside my entire corporate team from Apex Holdings. The energy in the courtyard was electric, vibrating with genuine hope and community triumph. I adjusted the microphone, letting a profound, respectful silence fall over the captivated crowd. I looked out at the sea of eager faces, taking a deep, cleansing breath. Generational wealth is not just about passing down money. I projected my voice, steady, resonant, and echoing powerfully across the courtyard. For too long, we have been sold a dangerous lie. We have been taught to chase an empty aesthetic of wealth at the absolute expense of our dignity, our peace, and our most vulnerable community members. We have allowed financial predators to strip the equity from our neighborhoods while hiding behind the facade of high society respectability. I gestured toward the gleaming glass and steel building towering behind me. True generational wealth is about passing down the knowledge of your own worth. It is about refusing to compromise your soul or your safety for proximity to power. Most importantly, it is about creating safe, impenetrable spaces where women are not forced to endure toxic, abusive environments just to survive. We are breaking destructive cycles today. We are taking back our equity, and we are building a solid, unshakable foundation that no predator can ever foreclose on. The crowd erupted into deafening applause. Politicians nodded enthusiastically, and journalists scrambled to record every single word of the address. The women who had already been approved for the first wave of leases stood near the front, wiping tears of relief and joy from their eyes. I stepped out from behind the acrylic podium and picked up the oversized ceremonial golden scissors. I smiled brightly for the flashing cameras, grasping the thick emerald green ribbon stretched across the main entrance. With one smooth, deliberate motion, I sliced cleanly through the fabric. Cheers echoed across the property, mingling with the celebratory music pouring from the sound system. But as the crowd surged forward to tour the new facility, my eyes caught a subtle flicker of movement near the very back of the gathering. Standing behind the metal police barricades completely separated from the VIP seating and the catered breakfast tables was Chloe. She was standing entirely alone on the public sidewalk, partially hidden behind a large ancient oak tree. She had clearly just finished her grueling graveyard shift at the discount grocery store. She was still wearing her mandatory uniform, the stiff, unflattering neon green polyester polo shirt, with her plastic name tag pinned crookedly to her chest. Her hair, which she used to spend hundreds of dollars maintaining every week, was pulled back into a messy, exhausted bun. Dark, heavy circles bruised the skin under her eyes, highlighting the brutal toll of working minimum wage to pay off federal restitution fines. Chloe stared up at the magnificent luxury standard building that now occupied the exact space where her fake high society life had previously flourished. Then she slowly looked down at her worn-out cashier uniform. She shoved her bare, unmanicured hands deep into the pockets of a cheap, thin windbreaker, shivering slightly in the morning breeze. I stood perfectly still on the manicured lawn, watching the devastating realization wash over her face in real time. She saw the wealthy, powerful sister she had relentlessly bullied and discarded, now standing at a podium surrounded by genuine adoration, immense respect, and tangible power. She looked at the empire I had built on the ashes of her lies, while she was permanently trapped in a cycle of poverty and public humiliation. In that quiet, agonizing moment behind the barricades, Chloe finally understood the absolute staggering magnitude of what she had thrown away, just to chase a fake, fraudulent aesthetic. Chloe did not call out my name. She did not raise her hand to wave, nor did she attempt to push past the metal police barricades to demand a place on the manicured lawn. The frantic, entitled golden child who had once stormed into my office demanding salvation was completely gone. In her place stood a thoroughly defeated woman who finally recognized that the bridge back to my life had been burned to ashes by her own hands. I watched from the podium as she slowly turned her back on the gleaming glass complex. She pulled the thin collar of her cheap windbreaker tight against her neck, shivering in the breeze, and began the long, humiliating walk down the public sidewalk toward the city bus stop. A year ago, my childhood conditioning would have forced me to drop the golden scissors and chase after her. I would have felt the crushing guilt my parents surgically implanted in my brain, the false narrative that her failures were my responsibility to fix. I would have offered her a job or a check to ease her discomfort. But as I watched her neon green cashier uniform disappear around the corner, my feet remained firmly planted on the stage. I did not move a single inch. I did not feel a shred of guilt, and I certainly did not feel any lingering obligation. The boundary was permanently, irrevocably set in stone. I had built a fortress for women who wanted to heal, but Chloe was still addicted to the very poison that had destroyed her. Letting her walk away was not an act of cruelty. It was the ultimate act of self-preservation. I turned my attention back to the flashing cameras, leaving my sister to board a public transit bus back to the squalor she had actively chosen. By 8 o'clock that evening, the corporate formalities concluded, giving way to a deeply personal celebration. I hosted a private dinner on the sweeping rooftop terrace of my downtown penthouse. The air was warm, carrying the scent of roasted garlic, seared ribeye, and expensive, perfectly aged bourbon. The city skyline sparkled below us, a sprawling sea of lights mirroring the magnitude of what we had achieved. But the most beautiful aspect of the evening was not the luxury catering or the breathtaking view. It was the guest list. There was not a single drop of biological blood present on that terrace. My parents were sitting in their cramped, mildew-scented apartment, entirely excluded from my joy. Instead, my rooftop was filled to the brim with my chosen family. Kendra sat at the head of the long, outdoor dining table, throwing her head back in genuine, uninhibited laughter. Beside her sat my senior commercial development partners, the fierce, brilliant black women and men who had worked 80-hour weeks alongside me to secure the zoning permits. Scattered around the fire pits were the seasoned industry mentors who opened doors for me when I was just a struggling junior appraiser trying to break into a heavily white male-dominated field. These were the people who had offered me a seat at the table when my own mother was actively trying to kick me out of the dining room. I stood near the edge of the glass balcony, holding a crystal flute of vintage champagne, simply observing the beautiful ecosystem I had curated. The contrast between this vibrant, authentic gathering and the stifling, anxiety-inducing holiday dinners I grew up with was staggering. At my parents' grand estate meals were exhausting, high-stakes performances. Every bite of food was served with a side of suffocating criticism. We were required to dress perfectly, speak softly, and mold our entire personalities to appease whatever wealthy white guests Julian had decided to parade through the front door. We had to pretend we were flawless, hiding our financial debts and emotional scars behind forced smiles and hollow discussions about country club politics. Here on my rooftop, no one was performing. No one was pretending to be anything they were not. We were loud, we were joyful, and we were completely free. When someone spoke, they were actually heard. When someone laughed, it was deeply genuine, echoing from the chest rather than the throat. We celebrated our victories without stepping on the necks of our own people to get there. I had built a multi-million-dollar empire, but looking at the people laughing around the fire pits, I realized my greatest achievement was creating a life entirely devoid of toxic manipulation. I took a slow, satisfying sip of my champagne, letting the crisp bubbles dance on my tongue. Just as I turned to rejoin the conversation at the dining table, the smartphone tucked into the pocket of my tailored silk trousers vibrated with a short, sharp buzz. I pulled the device out and glanced at the glowing screen. It was a new text message from an unsaved, unknown number. The area code was local, but the contact information was completely blank. I opened the message. It contained only 5 simple words: "I am proud of you." I stared at the glowing letters. I knew instantly that the message did not come from a business associate or a friend. It had the distinct, desperate stench of a biological relative trying to sneak through a cracked window. It was either Marcus or Helen sitting in their tiny apartment watching the local evening news broadcast covering my groundbreaking ceremony. They had seen the absolute undeniable proof that the daughter they discarded was now a titan of the city. One of them had borrowed a cheap burner phone to bypass the strict digital blocks I had placed on their accounts months ago. They were fishing. They were tossing a pathetic microscopic crumb of validation into the void, hoping the emotionally starved little girl they used to control would desperately snatch it up and invite them back into her luxurious life. I looked at the message again. "I am proud of you." A decade ago, reading those exact words would have brought me to my knees. I would have wept with gratitude. I would have sacrificed my own happiness, drained my bank accounts, and set myself on fire just to keep them warm. Now, standing on top of the world, feeling the cool night breeze against my skin, I felt absolutely nothing. I did not know if the text came from Marcus desperately wanting access to my wealth, or from Helen hoping to ride the coattails of my public success. And the most beautiful, liberating realization washed over me in that exact second. I truly did not care. I truly did not care. I pressed my thumb against the glowing screen of my smartphone, swiping the anonymous message to the left. A small red trash can icon appeared. I tapped it without a single ounce of hesitation. I did not stop there. I opened my settings, navigated to my blocked contacts list, and permanently restricted the unknown number. I locked the screen, slid the device back into the deep pocket of my tailored silk trousers, and released a long, steady breath into the warm evening air. The final microscopic thread, connecting me to the toxic dysfunction of my past, was officially severed. I was completely unburdened. I turned my back to the lively dining table and walked slowly toward the edge of my sprawling rooftop terrace. The city spread out beneath me like a glittering ocean of diamonds and gold. The sprawling skyline was a testament to ambition and architecture, a concrete jungle where I had clawed my way from the very bottom to the absolute pinnacle. I rested my forearms against the cool, thick glass of the balcony railing. The summer breeze swept across my face, carrying the distant, muted sounds of downtown traffic and the faint rhythm of a jazz band playing several blocks away. Behind me, the warm glow of the fire pits illuminated the faces of my chosen family. I could hear Kendra projecting her deep, booming laugh as she debated commercial zoning laws with my senior development partners. There was no tension in the air. There was no underlying anxiety threatening to suffocate the joy out of the room. It was just pure, unfiltered peace. Looking down at the sprawling metropolis, I allowed my mind to drift back over the grueling journey that had brought me to this exact altitude. For 3 decades, I had been forced into the grueling, thankless role of the family scapegoat. I was the designated shock absorber for every ounce of Marcus and Helen deep-seated insecurities. I was the dark-skinned, outspoken daughter they constantly tried to hide in the shadows, so my lighter, more compliant sister could bask in the spotlight. They had demanded my compliance. They had demanded my silence. They had demanded that I shrink myself down into a palatable, easily digestible version of a black woman, just so they could comfortably perform their tragic pantomime of high society wealth. They wanted me to be the sturdy mule carrying the heavy, rotting weight of their generational trauma. I refused the assignment. I had meticulously dismantled their entire fraudulent empire with nothing but property deeds, wire transfer logs, and an ironclad sense of my own self-worth. I had watched them auction off their dignity on the courthouse steps. I had watched Julian be dragged away in federal chains. I had watched Chloe shatter her own reflection because she could no longer hide behind a stolen designer handbag. A small, quiet part of my heart acknowledged the inherent grief of losing a biological family. It is a unique, profound mourning to accept that the people who gave you life are entirely incapable of giving you love. But that fleeting sorrow was absolutely eclipsed by the massive, overwhelming peace of finally finding myself. I had stepped out of the suffocating role of the family scapegoat and proudly stepped into the role of the master architect of my own destiny. I looked up at the stars piercing through the city smog, a slow, triumphant smile spreading across my face. People always say that living well is the best revenge, but they rarely understand the true mechanics of that statement. Sometimes the sweetest revenge is not actively plotting their demise. Sometimes the sweetest revenge is not watching them fall. It is making sure they have to stand on the ground, crane their necks backward, and watch you fly completely out of their reach. My thoughts shifted away from the ashes of my past and focused entirely on the brilliant, solid foundation of my future. Tomorrow morning at exactly 8 o'clock, the heavy steel gates of my new affordable housing complex would officially open. The moving trucks were already scheduled and paid for by my holding company. Dozens of single black mothers, domestic violence survivors, and women actively escaping the brutal chains of financial abuse would be handed the shiny new keys to their luxury standard apartments. They would walk into spaces featuring impact windows, quartz countertops, and rooftop gardens. They would step into homes where they were completely safe, unconditionally valued, and fiercely protected from the very same predatory lending practices that had destroyed my own family. I had taken the most agonizing, traumatic experiences of my life and weaponized them for the greater good. I had transformed my personal bleeding trauma into a monumental structural triumph for my entire community. I was not just building apartment complexes. I was engineering safe havens. I was establishing a new blueprint for what actual tangible generational wealth looks like when it is rooted in integrity and boundaries rather than proximity to white validation. The legacy I was leaving behind would outlast any country club membership or fake social media aesthetic. The sound of a delicate throat clearing broke through my intense internal monologue. I turned my head away from the glittering skyline. My lead development partner walked up beside me, her dark skin glowing in the firelight. She held 2 tall crystal flutes filled with crisp, bubbling vintage champagne. She extended one hand toward me, offering me the glass with a brilliant, knowing smile that communicated decades of shared corporate battles and hard-won victories. I reached out and took the chilled crystal stem between my fingers. "To the future," she asked, raising her glass slightly into the warm summer night. I looked at her, then looked back out over the empire I had built with my own 2 hands. I raised my glass to meet hers. The delicate crystal clinked together, the sound ringing crisp, sharp, and absolutely clear in the night air. To the equity we build for ourselves, I replied, my voice steady and vibrating with absolute certainty. I took a slow sip of the vintage champagne, letting the bright, effervescent liquid wash over my palate. That single word equity hung suspended between us, carrying a weight that went far beyond commercial real estate portfolios, interest rates, and profit margins. We were not just toasting to the massive financial empire we had constructed from the ground up. We were celebrating the emotional equity we had fiercely reclaimed. We were toasting to the sacred, impenetrable peace of mind that comes only when you finally stop bankrupting your own soul to fund the delusions of toxic people. I lowered my glass and looked around the sprawling rooftop terrace. The scene before me was a masterpiece of genuine human connection. The warm golden glow of the fire pits illuminated the faces of my chosen family. They were brilliant, ambitious, and relentlessly authentic. Black men and women who had fought their way into rooms that were historically designed to keep them out. They were laughing loudly, sharing stories, and lifting each other up without a single ounce of hidden jealousy or malicious intent. The air was rich with the scent of gourmet food and the soulful rhythmic bass of a classic rhythm and blues track drifting from the outdoor speakers. There was no anxiety here. No one was carefully measuring their words or shrinking their personality to fit into a suffocating manufactured aesthetic. It was a haven of absolute unfiltered joy. The contrast between this vibrant, thriving ecosystem and the cold, isolated reality my biological family had actively chosen was staggeringly profound. Somewhere across the city, far away from the glittering downtown skyline, Marcus and Helen were sitting in their cramped, dilapidated apartment. They were likely sitting in complete silence on a cheap, sagging sofa, surrounded by the nauseating smell of industrial bleach drifting up from the laundromat downstairs. They had no friends to call, no elite social calendar to manage, and no legacy left to brag about. Their entire existence had been reduced to waiting for a meager social security check to clear the bank. And across town, under the harsh, unforgiving glare of fluorescent grocery store lights, Chloe was standing on her aching feet, scanning discounted canned beans and enduring the pitying stares of strangers. They had sacrificed their actual flesh and blood for the illusion of superiority, and they had been rewarded with nothing but absolute destitution. They had bought into a highly toxic, deeply flawed definition of success. For my parents and my sister, black excellence was nothing more than a superficial performance. It was a hollow, desperate charade rooted entirely in their proximity to whiteness and their obsessive need for white validation. They believed that having a white son-in-law from Wall Street automatically elevated their social standing, regardless of the fact that he was a predatory con artist actively draining their wealth. They thought success meant carrying a $20,000 designer handbag, even if that bag was purchased with a fraudulent line of credit that would eventually leave them homeless. They valued country club memberships, luxury vehicles, and perfectly curated social media feeds over integrity, loyalty, and actual financial literacy. They were willing to endure, enable, and inflict unspeakable emotional abuse just to maintain a fragile, rotting facade. But as I stood on the top floor of my penthouse looking out over the multi-million-dollar housing complex I had just built for vulnerable women in my community, I knew the actual truth. I knew what true black excellence really looked like. It is not a designer label. It is not an invitation to an exclusive, segregated dinner party. True excellence is rooted in the unapologetic enforcement of personal boundaries. It is the courage to walk away from tables where respect is no longer being served, even if the people sitting at those tables share your exact DNA. It is the financial independence that allows you to buy your own freedom and build safe spaces for those coming up behind you. True excellence is breaking generational curses rather than passing them down wrapped in a shiny, expensive bow. It is the relentless, uncompromising commitment to your own peace. I had spent the first 3 decades of my life being treated as an inconvenience, a scapegoat, and a cynical disappointment. I had spent years trying to decode the impossible puzzle of how to make my parents love me as much as they loved the lie they were living. But I had finally stopped trying to solve a puzzle that was inherently rigged against me. I had simply flipped the board over and walked away. I did not destroy my family out of malice. I did not set a trap for them out of some villainous need for vengeance. I simply stopped being their human shield. I stepped out of the way, and I let the brutal, undeniable consequences of their own horrific choices crash down on them with the full weight of the federal justice system. They were the architects of their own demise. I was merely the appraiser who handed them the final devastating invoice. I turned my gaze away from the crowded dining table and looked back out over the sprawling, illuminated city skyline. The wind whipped gently through my hair, cool and incredibly refreshing against my skin. I rested my hand lightly on the thick glass railing of the balcony. My heart, which had spent so many years locked in a tight defensive fist, was completely open and entirely at rest. The sweetest revenge in the world is never found in screaming matches, bitter arguments, or desperate attempts to force toxic people to understand your worth. The sweetest, most devastating revenge is unshakable, unapologetic success. It is building a life so incredibly beautiful, so fiercely protected, and so profoundly authentic that the people who tried to break you cannot even reach the bottom step of your staircase. I brought the crystal champagne flute to my lips and took one final triumphant sip. A brilliant, radiant, and entirely genuine smile spread across my face, reflecting perfectly in the glass of the penthouse balcony. I had won the only game that actually mattered. I had won myself. The vibrant sounds of laughter and music swelled around me, filling the cool night air with the undeniable melody of absolute victory, as the glittering city lights slowly faded into a peaceful, unbroken black. The story of Maya teaches us that true excellence and generational wealth are never built on a foundation of fake aesthetics, toxic family dynamics, or the desperate pursuit of external validation. Real success requires the courage to enforce unwavering boundaries and walk away from tables where respect is no longer served. It proves that you do not owe your sanity to people who constantly belittle your worth. True power lies in financial independence and protecting your peace at all costs. Have you ever had to cut off toxic family members? Please like and subscribe to our channel for more stories.